Grisly attacks, church parking lot. 6 dead, 9 injured. September 1st, 2024. The morning of September 1st, 2024, dawned crisp and clear across the Gallatin Valley, with the Bridger Mountains standing sentinel against a sky the color of polished steel. At 6:47 a.m., the temperature registered 38 degrees Fahrenheit at Bozeman-Yellowstone International Airport, promising another of those perfect late summer Montana days that drew tourists by the thousands and reminded locals why they endured the brutal winters. Along the meandering path of the East Gallatin River, early morning joggers could see their breath in small puffs as they navigated the well-maintained trails that wound through the heart of Bozeman, past the Victorian homes of the historic district and toward the sprawling campus of Montana State University. St. Matthew's Baptist Church became a center for community support activities, with volunteers organizing meal trains, childcare assistance, and transportation for family members who needed to travel to the hospital daily. The church's fellowship hall was converted into a coordination center where volunteers could sign up for various support activities and where family members could receive updates about the victims' conditions. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the direct victims to include witnesses, first responders, and community members who had been affected by the incident. The Gallatin County Health Department organized crisis counseling services that were made available to anyone who felt they needed support in processing the trauma of the attack. These services were particularly important for the children who had witnessed the violence, as pediatric mental health professionals recognized that exposure to such extreme trauma could have long-lasting effects on developing minds. Dr. Patricia Ann Williams, a trauma specialist who coordinated the community mental health response, noted that the attack had created what psychologists term a community-wide traumatic event, in which the psychological impact extends far beyond those who were directly involved. Even residents who had not witnessed the attack reported feeling anxious about outdoor activities, changing their daily routines to avoid areas where wildlife might be present, and experiencing sleep disturbances related to intrusive thoughts about the incident. The economic impact of the attack began to manifest within days of the incident, as local tourism officials expressed concern about the potential effects on Bozeman's reputation as a safe destination for outdoor recreation. The Greater Yellowstone region's economy depends heavily on tourism, and incidents involving dangerous wildlife can have disproportionate effects on visitor confidence and travel patterns. Hotel cancellations and tour group postponements were reported within the first week following the attack, though the long-term economic effects would not be quantifiable for several months. Meanwhile, at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital, the medical teams continued their around-the-clock efforts to save the lives of the attack victims. Jennifer Patterson's condition remained critical throughout the first 48 hours following her surgery, as complications from her punctured lung and significant blood loss created ongoing challenges for her care team. Dr. Chen and her surgical colleagues performed 2 additional procedures during Jennifer's first week of hospitalization to address internal bleeding and infection risks that had developed as secondary complications to her initial injuries. The medical complexity of Jennifer's case was compounded by the unique nature of bear-inflicted wounds, which differ significantly from other types of trauma that hospital staff typically encounter. Bear claws create lacerations that are deeper and more irregular than knife wounds, while bear bites cause crushing injuries that damage multiple tissue types simultaneously. Additionally, the bacterial contamination associated with wildlife attacks creates infection risks that require specialized antibiotic protocols and careful monitoring. Tyler Patterson's recovery presented different but equally challenging medical issues. While his initial surgery had successfully repaired the major blood vessel damage caused by the bear's bite, The extensive nerve damage to his shoulder and arm created uncertainty about his long-term functional prognosis. Dr. Santos Rodriguez consulted with specialists at Children's Hospital Colorado and Seattle Children's Hospital to develop a comprehensive rehabilitation plan that would maximize Tyler's chances of regaining useful function in his injured arm. The pediatric medical team faced the additional challenge of providing age-appropriate explanations to Tyler about his injuries and treatment, while managing his emotional trauma related to the attack. Child life specialists worked closely with Tyler to help him understand his medical condition through play therapy and other techniques designed to reduce anxiety and promote psychological healing alongside his physical recovery. Robert Mason's treatment required the most extensive coordination between medical specialties, as his facial reconstruction involved multiple surgical teams working in sequence over several weeks. The initial life-saving procedures had stabilized his condition and prevented brain injury, but the cosmetic and functional restoration of his facial features would require a series of carefully planned surgeries spread over several months. The loss of Robert's left eye had significant implications for his future quality of life and occupational capacity. As an electrician, Robert's work required excellent depth perception and fine motor control, capabilities that would be significantly impaired by monocular vision. The hospital's occupational therapy team began working with Robert early in his recovery to assess his functional limitations and develop strategies for adapting to his changed visual capabilities. Madison Patterson's psychological treatment represented one of the most delicate aspects of the entire medical response to the attack. Dr. Rebecca Stewart, who specialized in childhood trauma, faced the challenge of helping an 8-year-old process an experience that would be difficult for adults to understand and integrate. Madison's treatment plan included both individual therapy sessions and family therapy involving her father, David Patterson, who had arrived from his business trip within hours of learning about the attack. David Patterson, a 36-year-old accountant who worked for a firm in Billings, had been attending a professional conference in Denver when he received the phone call that would change his family's life forever. His initial reaction was disbelief, as the caller's description of a bear attack seemed too bizarre to be real. However, the urgency in the hospital social worker's voice quickly convinced him that the impossible had indeed occurred, and he immediately chartered a private flight to return to Bozeman. David's arrival at the hospital 12 hours after the attack marked the beginning of what would become a months-long vigil as his wife and son fought for their lives and recovery. His first priority was getting to Tyler's bedside, where he found his 5-year-old son heavily sedated and connected to multiple monitoring devices that tracked his vital signs and administered pain medication. The sight of his child's bandaged and immobilized arm was devastating, but David's relief that Tyler was alive overshadowed his concern about the permanent consequences of the injuries. Jennifer's condition was more critical than Tyler's, and David's reunion with his wife was complicated by her sedated state and the extensive medical equipment surrounding her bed. The trauma team had placed Jennifer in a medically induced coma to allow her body to focus its energy on healing rather than managing pain and consciousness. Dr. Chen explained to David that Jennifer's injuries were severe but potentially survivable, though her recovery would likely require months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. The conversation between David Patterson and Dr. Chen, documented in the hospital's social services records, provides insight into the human cost of the attack beyond the immediate medical consequences. David's questions focused not only on his family's immediate medical prognosis, but also on practical concerns about insurance coverage, long-term care requirements, and the family's financial stability during what was likely to be an extended recovery period. The financial implications of the attack would prove to be staggering. Jennifer's medical bills were projected to exceed $500,000, while Tyler's treatment costs were estimated at over $200,000. Robert Mason faced similar expenses, and even Madison's psychological treatment was expected to cost tens of thousands of dollars over several years. These figures represented amounts that would bankrupt most middle-class families, even those with good health insurance coverage. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks faced potential liability for the attack costs under state regulations that held government agencies responsible for damages caused by wildlife they managed. However, the department's legal team argued that Bear 294's attack was an unforeseeable incident that occurred despite appropriate management protocols, making government liability questionable under existing case law. The legal complexities surrounding the attack attracted the attention of several prominent personal injury law firms who recognized the case's potential for significant financial settlements. Within a week of the incident, the Patterson family had been contacted by attorneys from across the region offering to represent them in potential lawsuits against various government agencies, the church, and other parties who might bear responsibility for the attack. However, David Patterson's immediate focus remained on his family's medical recovery rather than legal action. His wife remained in critical condition, his son faced an uncertain prognosis for arm function, and his daughter was struggling with trauma symptoms that included nightmares, refusal to leave the house, and regression to behaviors she had outgrown years earlier. The legal questions, while important for the family's long-term financial security, seemed secondary to the immediate crisis of survival and healing. The investigation into the attack continued to reveal disturbing gaps in the systems designed to prevent human-wildlife conflicts. Dr. Morrison's detailed analysis of Bear 294's tracking data showed that the animal had been moving through the Cottonwood Road area for over 3 weeks before the attack, making multiple daylight appearances that should have triggered enhanced monitoring protocols. The trail camera data was particularly troubling, as it showed Bear 294 investigating human scents and garbage containers with increasing boldness over the weeks leading up to the attack. On August 15th, cameras captured the bear spending over an hour investigating a residential garbage container, behavior that represented a clear escalation in his food conditioning. On August 22nd, the bear was recorded approaching within 50 yards of an occupied residential dwelling during daylight hours, an incident that should have immediately triggered Category 3 management protocols requiring the bear's removal from the population. However, the trail camera data was not routinely reviewed by wildlife management personnel due to staffing limitations and competing priorities. The cameras were checked monthly rather than weekly, meaning that Bear 294's escalating behavioral problems were not identified until after the attack had occurred. This delay represented a critical failure in the early warning systems that are essential for preventing dangerous wildlife encounters in urban areas. The investigation also revealed that several residents of the Cottonwood Road area had observed Bear 294 during the weeks before the attack, but had failed to report these sightings to authorities. Mrs. Elizabeth Sarah Hernandez, who lived approximately half a mile from the church, had photographed the bear in her backyard on August 18th, but had shared the images only on social media rather than reporting the sighting to wildlife authorities. Similarly, Mr. James Robert Thompson, a retiree who lived near the wildlife corridor, had observed the bear on multiple occasions but had assumed that wildlife authorities were already aware of the animal's presence. His failure to report the sightings represented a common problem in wildlife management, where residents assume that someone else has already taken appropriate action or that isolated sightings are not significant enough to warrant official reports. The cumulative effect of these unreported sightings was to create a false sense of security among wildlife management personnel who believed that Bear 294 was moving through the area rather than establishing a pattern of residence. Had the sightings been reported in a timely manner, the bear's presence would have triggered enhanced monitoring and possibly relocation procedures that could have prevented the attack. Dr. Morrison's investigation also examined the broader context of human-bear conflicts in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, revealing troubling trends that suggested the St. Matthew's Baptist Church attack was part of a larger pattern of increasing wildlife-human conflicts. The number of reported bear incidents in the Bozeman area had increased by over 40% in the previous 5 years, while funding for wildlife management programs had remained flat or declined in real terms. This mismatch between increasing conflict frequency and stable management resources had created what Dr. Morrison described as a crisis of capacity in wildlife management agencies throughout the region. Wildlife biologists were managing larger caseloads with fewer resources, resulting in delayed responses to emerging problems and reduced effectiveness of preventive measures. The personnel shortage was particularly acute in the area of human-wildlife conflict specialists, professionals who are trained to assess behavioral problems in individual animals and implement appropriate management responses. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks employed only 3 such specialists to cover the entire southwestern region of the state, an area encompassing thousands of square miles and hundreds of potentially problematic bears. Bear 294's case file revealed that he had been assigned a risk assessment priority of moderate, despite documented aggressive encounters with humans in wilderness areas. This classification was based primarily on the remote locations of previous incidents, rather than the bear's demonstrated willingness to engage in aggressive behavior toward people. The classification system's emphasis on incident location rather than behavioral indicators represented a significant flaw in risk assessment protocols that contributed to the delayed response to Bear 294's escalating problems. The federal investigation conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service examined these systemic issues from the perspective of Endangered Species Act compliance and federal wildlife management responsibilities. The investigators found that while individual personnel had generally followed existing protocols, the protocols themselves were inadequate for managing the increasing complexity of human-wildlife conflicts in rapidly developing areas. The investigation's preliminary findings, released 6 weeks after the attack, identified several areas where improved coordination between federal, state, and local agencies could enhance wildlife management effectiveness. These recommendations included expanded funding for conflict specialists, improved communication protocols between agencies, and enhanced public education programs designed to increase reporting of wildlife sightings in urban areas. However, the implementation of these recommendations would require legislative action and significant budget increases at both state and federal levels, changes that could take years to achieve given competing political priorities and fiscal constraints. The victims of the St. Matthew's Baptist Church attack would derive little immediate benefit from these long-term policy improvements, though their tragedy might contribute to preventing similar incidents in the future. The media coverage of the attack evolved in the weeks following the incident, shifting from sensational reporting of the immediate events to more substantive analysis of the broader issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts. National news magazines published extensive features examining the challenges of wildlife management in rapidly developing Western communities, using the Bozeman attack as a case study of systemic failures in current approaches. Environmental groups used the incident to advocate for increased funding for wildlife management programs and stricter development controls in areas designated as wildlife habitat. Conversely, property rights advocates argued that the attack demonstrated the need for more aggressive wildlife control measures and reduced restrictions on development in areas where dangerous animals might pose threats to human safety. The political implications of the attack became apparent during the state legislative session that convened 3 months after the incident. Several legislators introduced bills that would have significantly altered wildlife management protocols, including measures that would have required the immediate removal of any large carnivore observed in populated areas, and others that would have increased penalties for residents who failed to report wildlife sightings. However, the complexity of wildlife management issues and the competing interests involved made legislative solutions difficult to achieve. Wildlife biologists argued that overly aggressive removal policies could violate Federal Endangered Species Act protections and might actually increase human-wildlife conflicts by disrupting established animal behavior patterns. Conversely, public safety advocates maintained that the protection of human life should take precedence over wildlife conservation concerns in areas where conflicts were likely to occur. The debate was further complicated by economic considerations related to tourism and outdoor recreation, industries that depend on the presence of wildlife for their appeal to visitors. Complete removal of large carnivores from areas surrounding developed communities would fundamentally alter the character of the Greater Yellowstone region and could have significant negative effects on the tourism-dependent economy. Pastor Collins found himself drawn into these broader policy debates as media outlets sought his perspective on the balance between wildlife conservation and public safety. His statements consistently emphasized the need for evidence-based solutions that protected both human communities and wildlife populations, while avoiding the polarization that characterized much of the public discourse surrounding the incident. The church community's response to the attack reflected this balanced approach, with congregation members supporting both enhanced wildlife management funding and improved safety protocols for community activities. A memorial service for Dorothy Kowalski, held 6 weeks after her death, became a focal point for community healing and a platform for advocating practical solutions to human-wildlife conflict issues. Dorothy's memorial service was attended by over 800 people, including representatives from wildlife management agencies, law enforcement, and elected officials from across the region. The service featured tributes to Dorothy's heroic actions and presentations about wildlife safety measures that communities could implement to reduce conflict risks. One of the most moving aspects of the memorial was a presentation by Dr. Morrison about Dorothy's role in saving lives during the attack. The wildlife biologist's detailed analysis of the security footage showed that Dorothy's actions had created the crucial seconds needed for other church members to reach safety, and that her intervention had almost certainly prevented additional casualties. The memorial also featured the announcement of the Dorothy Kowalski Wildlife Safety Foundation, a non-profit organization established by her family to fund research into human-wildlife conflict prevention and to provide emergency financial assistance to victims of wildlife attacks. The foundation's initial funding came from donations collected at the memorial service and from a matching grant provided by the Montana Community Foundation. The Foundation's first initiative was the development of a smartphone app that would allow residents to report wildlife sightings directly to state and federal wildlife management agencies. The app, designed by computer science students at Montana State University, included features for uploading photographs, GPS location data, and behavioral observations that would help wildlife managers assess the significance of reported sightings. The app's development reflected a broader trend toward technological solutions for wildlife management challenges, Trail cameras with cellular connectivity were being deployed throughout the greater Yellowstone region to provide real-time monitoring of animal movements, while GPS collar technology was being used to track the movements of individual problem animals with unprecedented precision. However, technology alone could not address the fundamental resource constraints that limited wildlife management effectiveness. The installation and maintenance of monitoring equipment required trained personnel and ongoing funding commitments that strained agency budgets. Additionally, the data generated by technological monitoring systems was only valuable if qualified personnel were available to analyze it and respond appropriately to emerging problems. The question of adequate funding for wildlife management programs became a central issue in the political aftermath of the attack. Cost-benefit analyses conducted by state and federal agencies showed that every dollar invested in proactive wildlife management prevented an average of $15 in damages from human-wildlife conflicts. However, the political reality was that prevention programs were often viewed as less urgent than immediate crises, making it difficult to secure adequate funding for proactive measures. The Patterson family's medical recovery continued to be the primary focus of media attention and community support efforts. Jennifer's condition gradually stabilized during her second month of hospitalization, though her recovery was complicated by several episodes of infection that required additional surgical procedures. The irregular nature of bear-inflicted wounds made them particularly susceptible to bacterial contamination, and the extensive tissue damage complicated the healing process. Tyler's recovery progressed more rapidly than his mother's, with the 5-year-old showing remarkable resilience in adapting to his injuries. However, the extent of nerve damage to his left arm became apparent as the initial swelling subsided and neurological function could be accurately assessed. Tyler would likely never regain full use of his left arm, though intensive physical therapy might restore partial function over time. The psychological impact of the attack on Tyler was less severe than many professionals had expected, partly due to his young age and partly due to the comprehensive support provided by the hospital's child life specialists. Tyler's memories of the attack were fragmented and primarily focused on his concern for his mother rather than his own injuries, a cognitive pattern that child psychologists recognized as protective for his long-term mental health. Madison's psychological recovery was more complex and would require ongoing therapy for an extended period. Her symptoms included classic signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, hypervigilance, and avoidance behaviors related to outdoor activities. Dr. Stewart's treatment plan involved a combination of individual therapy, family therapy, and gradual exposure exercises designed to help Madison develop coping strategies for managing her trauma responses. Robert Mason's recovery was the most prolonged and challenging of all the attack victims. The extensive facial reconstruction required multiple surgeries spread over 6 months, with each procedure building on the previous work to restore both function and appearance. The loss of his left eye created permanent visual limitations that would affect his ability to return to his previous occupation as an electrician. The workers' compensation claim related to Robert's injuries raised complex legal questions about whether a wildlife attack occurring on church property during volunteer work constituted a workplace injury. These questions would ultimately be resolved through litigation that extended for over 2 years, creating additional financial stress for Robert and his family during his recovery period. The broader community response to the attack included the establishment of several new safety protocols for outdoor activities in the Bozeman area. Schools implemented enhanced wildlife awareness training for students and staff, while businesses operating in areas near wildlife habitat developed emergency response plans for potential animal encounters. The Gallatin County Emergency Management Agency updated its mass casualty incident protocols to include specific procedures for wildlife attacks, recognizing that such incidents required specialized response capabilities that differed from other types of emergencies. These protocols included provisions for coordinating with wildlife management agencies and for managing the unique medical challenges associated with animal-inflicted injuries. Local hospitals throughout the region also updated their emergency preparedness plans to include protocols for treating wildlife attack victims. The unique characteristics of bear-inflicted injuries required specialized knowledge and equipment that were not typically part of standard trauma care protocols. Training programs were developed to ensure that emergency medical personnel throughout the region would be prepared to respond effectively to similar incidents in the future. The attack's impact on St. Matthew's Baptist Church was profound and lasting. Worship attendance initially declined as some members struggled with anxiety about returning to the site where the attack had occurred. Pastor Collins and the church leadership implemented several measures to address these concerns, including enhanced security measures, modified parking arrangements, and the installation of emergency communication systems. The church also established a victim support ministry that provided ongoing assistance to the Patterson family and other attack victims. This ministry coordinated meal delivery, transportation assistance, and other practical support during the extended recovery period. The ministry's activities were funded through special offerings and donations from other churches throughout the region. The physical reminders of the attack were gradually removed from the church property, though the decision to eliminate all traces of the incident was controversial among congregation members. Some felt that a memorial to Dorothy Kowalski should be permanently installed on the church grounds, while others preferred to focus on moving forward rather than preserving reminders of the tragedy. The compromise solution was the establishment of a memorial garden on a portion of the church property that was removed from the site of the actual attack. The garden featured native Montana plants that were selected for their ability to attract wildlife without creating food sources that might draw dangerous animals to the area. A bronze plaque honoring Dorothy's sacrifice was installed at the garden center, providing a focal point for remembrance and reflection. The wildlife corridor adjacent to the church property was modified following the attack to reduce the likelihood of similar incidents in the future. Additional fencing was installed to create better separation between the corridor and developed areas, while enhanced lighting was added to improve visibility during early morning and evening hours when wildlife activity was most likely. These modifications were implemented through a collaborative effort involving the church, the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the City of Bozeman. The cost of the improvements was shared among the various stakeholders, with funding provided through a combination of insurance settlements, government appropriations, and community donations. However, wildlife management experts acknowledged that physical barriers and lighting improvements could only reduce rather than eliminate the risk of future conflicts. The fundamental challenge of managing large carnivores in areas of increasing human development would require ongoing vigilance and adaptive management strategies that could respond to changing conditions over time. The scientific analysis of the attack provided valuable insights into bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict dynamics that would inform management strategies throughout North America. Dr. Morrison's detailed behavioral analysis of Bear 294's actions, based on security footage and physical evidence, became a case study that was widely used in wildlife management training programs. The analysis revealed several previously unrecognized patterns in the behavioral escalation that led to the attack. Bear 294's progression from food conditioning to aggressive predation followed a sequence that had not been well documented in previous research, providing important insights for early identification of potentially dangerous animals. The research also highlighted the importance of community involvement in wildlife monitoring and reporting. The attack might have been prevented if residents had been more aware of the significance of their wildlife observations and had reported them in a timely manner to appropriate authorities. Educational programs developed in response to the attack emphasized the role that individual citizens could play in wildlife management through proper reporting of animal sightings and adherence to guidelines for secure food storage and garbage disposal. These programs were implemented throughout the Greater Yellowstone region and became models for similar efforts in other areas where human-wildlife conflicts were common. The long-term outcomes of the attack continued to unfold over the months and years following the incident. Jennifer Patterson eventually recovered sufficiently to return to work as a nurse, though she required multiple additional surgeries and would live with permanent limitations related to her injuries. Her experience led her to specialize in trauma nursing, where her personal understanding of recovery challenges enhanced her ability to provide compassionate care to other victims. Tyler Patterson's arm function improved gradually through intensive physical therapy, though he never regained full use of his left arm. Despite these limitations, Tyler adapted well to his challenges and became an advocate for wildlife safety education in schools throughout Montana. His presentations to elementary school students, accompanied by wildlife education specialists, helped thousands of children understand how to respond appropriately to wildlife encounters. Madison Patterson's psychological recovery was gradual but ultimately successful. Her therapy with Dr. Stewart continued for over 3 years, during which she developed effective coping strategies for managing her trauma responses. Madison's artistic talents emerged during her therapy, and she began creating wildlife paintings that reflected both the beauty and danger of Montana's natural environment. Robert Mason's recovery was the most challenging of all the victims. The permanent loss of vision in his left eye ended his career as an electrician, requiring him to retrain for a new occupation that could accommodate his visual limitations. He eventually became a safety instructor, using his experience to help others understand the importance of workplace safety and emergency preparedness. Dorothy Kowalski's legacy lived on through the foundation established in her memory and through the safety improvements implemented at churches and community facilities throughout the region. Her actions during the attack were recognized with several posthumous awards, including a commendation from the Montana Governor's Office and a National Wildlife Safety Award from the National Wildlife Federation. The legal proceedings related to the attack were resolved through a series of settlements that provided financial compensation to the victims and their families. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks accepted partial responsibility for the incident and agreed to implement enhanced monitoring protocols and increased funding for human-wildlife conflict prevention programs. The church's insurance company also provided significant settlements to the attack victims, though these payments came with restrictions on future liability and requirements for enhanced safety measures at church facilities. The settlement agreements included provisions for ongoing medical care and rehabilitation services for the victims. However, no amount of financial compensation could fully address the human cost of the attack. The physical and psychological injuries inflicted by Bear 294 would affect the victims for the rest of their lives, while the loss of Dorothy Kowalski created a permanent void in the church community and her extended family. The broader implications of the attack continued to influence wildlife management policies and practices throughout the western United States. The incident became a case study that was analyzed in university wildlife management programs and professional training courses for wildlife biologists and law enforcement officers. The attack also contributed to increased public awareness of human-wildlife conflict issues and the challenges faced by wildlife management agencies in balancing conservation goals with public safety concerns. This increased awareness led to enhanced funding for wildlife management programs in several states and improved coordination between agencies responsible for public safety and wildlife conservation. The technological innovations developed in response to the attack, including the smartphone app for reporting wildlife sightings and improved trail camera monitoring systems, were adopted by wildlife management agencies throughout North America. These tools improved the ability of agencies to monitor wildlife populations and respond quickly to emerging conflict situations. The community response to the attack demonstrated the resilience and compassion that characterize small Western communities when faced with tragedy. The fundraising efforts, volunteer activities, and ongoing support provided to the victims reflected the best aspects of community solidarity and mutual aid. However, the attack also revealed vulnerabilities in the systems designed to protect both human communities and wildlife populations. The gaps in monitoring, reporting, and response protocols that contributed to the tragedy highlighted the need for continued investment in wildlife management infrastructure and personnel. The memorial service held on the first anniversary of the attack brought together survivors, family members, community leaders, and wildlife management professionals to reflect on the lessons learned and the progress made in preventing similar tragedies. The service featured updates on the victims' recovery, reports on safety improvements implemented throughout the region, and commitments to continued vigilance in managing human-wildlife conflicts. Pastor Collins's remarks at the anniversary service emphasized the importance of learning from tragedy while maintaining hope for the future. His message of resilience, community support, and responsible stewardship of natural resources resonated with attendees and provided a framework for moving forward from the trauma of the attack. The attack at St. Matthew's Baptist Church would be remembered not only as a tragedy, but also as a catalyst for positive changes in wildlife management practices and community preparedness. The lives lost and forever changed by Bear 294's rampage would not be forgotten, but they would also serve as inspiration for continued efforts to protect both human communities and the wildlife that shares Montana's magnificent landscape. In the end, the story of September 1st, 2024, became part of the larger narrative of human adaptation to life in areas where wilderness and civilization intersect. The attack served as a sobering reminder that despite technological advances and management efforts, the natural world remains inherently unpredictable and potentially dangerous. However, it also demonstrated the human capacity for heroism, compassion, and learning from tragedy to create safer communities for future generations. Sat on a gentle rise at 4,127 Cottonwood Road, approximately 2 3/4 miles southeast of downtown Bozeman, nestled between the newer developments of the Meadow Creek subdivision and the older, more established neighborhoods that had grown up around the original homesteads. The church building itself was a testament to the community's growth over the past 3 decades, having been expanded twice since its original construction in 1987. The main sanctuary, clad in warm, honey-colored brick with limestone accents, could accommodate 450 worshippers, while the adjacent fellowship hall and education wing provided space for the various ministries that served the congregation's 137 active members. Pastor Gerald Wayne Collins had arrived at the church at 6:15 a.m., as was his custom every Sunday morning, his silver Toyota Camry pulling into the reserved parking space closest to the main entrance. At 62 years old, Gerald stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with thinning grey hair and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had served St. Matthew's for 14 years, having come to Montana from a smaller congregation in Missoula after completing his Master of Divinity at Denver Seminary. His wife, Margaret, often joked that he looked more like a college professor than a Baptist preacher, which wasn't entirely inaccurate given his previous career as a high school history teacher before answering what he described as his second calling to ministry. The church parking lot was a large asphalt expanse that could accommodate nearly 200 vehicles, with additional overflow parking available in the gravel lot behind the fellowship hall. The property backed up against a narrow corridor of undeveloped land that provided a buffer between the church and the newer residential developments to the east. This corridor, roughly 300 yards wide and stretching for nearly a mile, consisted primarily of cottonwood trees, serviceberry bushes, and tall prairie grass, with a small seasonal creek running through its center. While it looked like natural habitat to the casual observer, it was actually a designated wildlife corridor maintained by the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks as part of their urban wildlife management program. What most of the church members didn't know, and what would prove tragically significant, was that this corridor served as a regular travel route for various wildlife species moving between the Gallatin National Forest to the south and the Bridger Mountains to the northeast. The corridor had been specifically designed to allow animals to navigate around the increasingly developed areas of Bozeman without coming into direct conflict with human populations. Trail cameras maintained by the State Wildlife Department had recorded regular passages by white-tailed deer, elk, mountain lions, black bears, and occasionally grizzly bears. The previous evening, Saturday, August 31st, those same trail cameras had captured images of a large adult male grizzly bear moving through the corridor at approximately 11:43 p.m. The bear, later identified through genetic analysis as a 22-year-old male weighing an estimated 740 pounds, had been tagged and monitored by wildlife biologists since 2019. Known to researchers as Bear 294, this particular animal had a documented history of aggressive encounters with humans, though previous incidents had occurred in more remote wilderness areas where such encounters were considered relatively normal. Bear 294's presence in the urban corridor wasn't entirely unusual during late summer and early fall, when bears were in the hyperphagia phase of their annual cycle, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day in preparation for winter hibernation. However, this particular bear had shown increasing signs of food conditioning over the previous 2 years, having learned to associate human activity with easily accessible food sources. He had been relocated twice in 2023, first from a campground near Big Sky, where he had broken into multiple RVs, and again from a residential area in Livingston, where he had destroyed several garbage containers and broken into a garage. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks had classified Bear 294 as a Category 2 bear under their management protocols, meaning he was considered a potential public safety risk but hadn't yet exhibited behavior severe enough to warrant removal from the population. The department's standard protocol for Category 2 bears involved enhanced monitoring, aversive conditioning when possible, and relocation as a last resort. However, budget constraints and the increasing number of bear-human conflicts across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had stretched the department's resources thin, leaving many potentially problematic animals under less intensive supervision than wildlife biologists would have preferred. Dr. Elizabeth Sarah Morrison, the lead wildlife biologist responsible for bear management in the Gallatin Valley, had reviewed Bear 294's file just 3 days before the attack. At 47 years old, Dr. Morrison had spent over 2 decades studying grizzly bear behavior and human-wildlife conflicts throughout Montana and Wyoming. She held a PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Montana and had authored dozens of peer-reviewed papers on bear ecology and management. Her assessment of Bear 294, documented in a report dated August 29, 2024, noted several concerning behavioral patterns that suggested the bear was becoming increasingly bold around human habitation. The report, which would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the subsequent investigation, documented that Bear 294 had been observed on security cameras at 3 different residential properties along the Cottonwood Road corridor during the month of August. In each case, the bear had approached human structures during daylight hours, showing none of the typical wariness that characterizes normal grizzly bear behavior around people. The bear had also been observed investigating vehicles parked along Forest Service roads, behavior that wildlife biologists consider a significant red flag for food conditioning. Dr. Morrison's report recommended immediate relocation of Bear 294 to a remote area of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, at least 200 miles from any significant human population. However, the logistics of such an operation required coordination with multiple agencies and could cost upwards of $15,000, including helicopter transport, specialized equipment, and personnel from multiple departments. The operation had been scheduled for September 5, 2024, pending final approval from the regional supervisor and coordination with the U.S. Forest Service for access to the proposed relocation site. The delay of 4 days would prove fatal. At 7:23 a.m. on September 1st, Bear 294 emerged from the wildlife corridor and began investigating the perimeter of the church parking lot. Security footage from the church's surveillance system, which had been upgraded just 6 months earlier as part of a broader security enhancement project, captured the bear's initial approach with startling clarity. The timestamp on the footage showed the bear first appearing at the eastern edge of the parking lot at exactly 7:23:17 a.m., his massive form moving with the deceptively fluid gait characteristic of his species. The bear's behavior during these initial minutes was consistent with what wildlife biologists call investigative or exploratory activity. He moved along the parking lot's perimeter, nose to the ground, clearly following scent trails that had caught his attention. His body language showed curiosity rather than aggression, ears forward and head moving from side to side as he processed the various smells emanating from the area. To an untrained observer, the bear might have appeared almost benign, like an enormous dog investigating an interesting new environment. What the bear was actually doing, as later analysis by Dr. Morrison would reveal, was cataloguing the various food-related scents that permeated the area around the church. The Fellowship Hall's commercial kitchen, which had been used the previous evening for a church potluck dinner, still carried the lingering aromas of the barbecue dinner that had fed over 200 people. Additionally, several dumpsters behind the building contained food waste from the event, creating what wildlife biologists term an attractive nuisance for opportunistic scavengers. At 7:31 a.m., the bear's attention was drawn to a specific area near the main entrance where someone had apparently spilled food or beverages. Security footage showed the animal lowering his head and spending several minutes investigating this location, his tongue occasionally visible as he licked at the pavement. This behavior, known as scent marking or olfactory investigation, is completely normal for bears encountering new food sources. However, it also indicated that Bear 294 was beginning to associate the church property with available food resources, a cognitive connection that would have potentially dangerous implications for future encounters. Inside the church, Pastor Collins was completely unaware of the drama unfolding in his parking lot. He had spent the previous hour in his study, making final preparations for the morning's sermon, which was to be the third in a series about community resilience in the face of adversity. The irony of this theme would not be lost on him in the weeks to come. His sermon notes, found later scattered across his desk in the chaos that would follow, included quotes from Romans 8:28 and Jeremiah 29:11, verses about God working all things together for good and having plans for hope and a future. The first members of the congregation began arriving at approximately 8:15 a.m., which was typical for the 9:30 a.m. worship service. Early arrivals usually included the volunteer musicians, sound technicians, and various ministry leaders who needed time to prepare for the morning's activities. Among the first to arrive was Mrs. Dorothy Helen Kowalski, an 83-year-old widow who had been a member of St. Matthew's since its founding. Dorothy served as the head usher and coordinator of volunteers, roles she had held for over 15 years, despite the gentle suggestions of family members that she might want to consider slowing down a bit. Dorothy's burgundy Buick LeSabre pulled into the parking lot at 8:17 a.m., the same spot she had occupied every Sunday for the past decade, approximately 50 yards from the main entrance in the third row of the central parking area. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing perhaps 110 pounds, Dorothy was the type of person who could organize a church dinner for 300 people with military precision, while simultaneously coordinating the children's Christmas pageant and managing the volunteer schedule for the church's food pantry. Her late husband, Frank, had often joked that Dorothy could run the Pentagon if they gave her a chance, and most people who knew her believed he was probably right. What made Dorothy's presence particularly significant that morning was her habit of arriving early and walking completely around the church property to check for any maintenance issues or security concerns. This routine, which she had developed after a series of minor vandalism incidents 3 years earlier, involved a careful inspection of the building's exterior, the parking lot, and the grounds immediately surrounding the church. On most Sundays, this walk revealed nothing more interesting than the occasional piece of litter or a light bulb that needed replacing in one of the exterior fixtures. At 8:22 a.m., Dorothy began her customary inspection walk. Starting at the main entrance and proceeding clockwise around the building, she was approximately halfway through her circuit, near the northeast corner of the Fellowship Hall, when she encountered the first clear evidence of Bear 294's presence: fresh tracks in the soft earth of a flower bed, each print showing the distinctive claw marks that clearly identified them as belonging to a large bear, stopped Dorothy in her tracks. The prints were enormous, each measuring nearly 12 inches in length and showing the characteristic shape of a grizzly bear's front paw. Dorothy had lived in Montana her entire life and was no stranger to wildlife encounters. Her late husband had been an avid hunter, and she had grown up on a ranch outside of Livingston where bears were a regular, if usually unwelcome, presence. She recognized immediately that these tracks were fresh, probably made within the past few hours based on their sharp definition and the lack of any dew or debris in the impressions. More concerning was the size of the tracks, which indicated a bear significantly larger than the black bears that occasionally wandered through residential areas of Bozeman. Dorothy's first instinct was to return to her car and call the appropriate authorities, but her inspection of the tracks revealed something that made her decide to investigate further. The tracks led away from the flower bed toward the back of the property, suggesting that whatever bear had made them was no longer in the immediate vicinity of the church. Additionally, her ranch upbringing had taught her that bears typically avoided areas with significant human activity, especially during daylight hours. She reasoned that the animal had probably passed through during the night and was long gone by morning. This assumption would prove tragically incorrect. Bear 294 had indeed moved away from the immediate church building, but he had not left the property. Instead, he had retreated to the dense vegetation along the wildlife corridor, a position that provided excellent concealment while still allowing him to monitor activity around the church. From this vantage point, approximately 150 yards from the main parking lot, the bear could observe the increasing human activity while remaining completely hidden from view. This behavior, known as surveillance or monitoring, is not uncommon among food-conditioned bears who have learned to time their foraging activities around human schedules. What made Bear 294's behavior particularly dangerous was his lack of the natural wariness that keeps most bears at a safe distance from human activity. Years of associating humans with food sources had fundamentally altered his risk assessment patterns, creating a psychological profile that wildlife biologists refer to as human habituated with food conditioning. Bears exhibiting this behavioral pattern often appear calm and non-threatening right up until the moment they decide to investigate a particular food source or defend what they perceive as their territory. At 8:47 a.m., the bear's attention was captured by the arrival of several vehicles in quick succession. Among these was a white Ford Explorer, driven by Jennifer Marie Patterson, a 34-year-old registered nurse who served as the church's children's ministry coordinator. Jennifer had arrived early because she was responsible for setting up the nursery and preparing materials for the children's Sunday school classes. Her two children, 8-year-old Madison Rose Patterson and 5-year-old Tyler James Patterson, were with her as they were every Sunday morning. Jennifer's arrival was significant for several reasons that would become apparent only in retrospect. First, her vehicle was parked relatively close to the wildlife corridor in an area that would become the focal point of the bear's eventual attack. Second, her children were carrying several items that would prove highly attractive to a food-conditioned bear, including a small cooler containing their snacks for after church and a backpack with goldfish crackers that Madison had forgotten to eat the previous day. Finally, Jennifer's routine involved spending several minutes outside her vehicle, organizing materials and helping her children gather their belongings, creating a period of vulnerability that would coincide exactly with the bear's decision to investigate the parking lot more closely. The morning air carried the various scents from Jennifer's vehicle directly toward Bear 294's hiding spot in the vegetation. The goldfish crackers, in particular, created what Dr. Morrison would later describe as a powerful olfactory attractant for a food-conditioned bear. The processed cheese flavoring in such snacks contains compounds that are detectable by bears at concentrations far below human sensory thresholds. And bears that have learned to associate these scents with easily obtained food sources often show extremely focused and persistent investigative behavior. At 8:52 a.m., Bear 294 began moving toward the parking lot. Security footage captured the beginning of this movement, though the bear remained largely concealed by vegetation for the first several minutes of his approach. His movement pattern was methodical and purposeful, characteristics that suggested he was not simply passing through the area, but was actively targeting specific scents that had caught his attention. Wildlife behavior analysis, conducted months later, would identify this as the critical transition point where Bear 294 shifted from passive surveillance to active hunting behavior. The term hunting behavior, in the context of human-bear encounters, refers to the focused, goal-directed activity that bears exhibit when pursuing specific food sources. This behavior is fundamentally different from the opportunistic scavenging that characterizes most bear-human interactions. Hunting behavior involves systematic approach patterns, sustained attention to target scents, and a willingness to overcome obstacles or investigate novel situations in pursuit of food rewards. Bears exhibiting hunting behavior toward human-associated food sources represent the highest category of public safety risk in wildlife management protocols. Jennifer Patterson was completely unaware of the approaching danger as she helped Madison and Tyler gather their Sunday school materials from the back of the Explorer. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair and green eyes, Jennifer had the efficient, no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. As a pediatric nurse at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital, she was trained to remain calm under pressure and respond quickly to emergency situations. These skills would serve her well in the coming minutes, though nothing in her medical training had prepared her for the type of crisis that was about to unfold. Madison Patterson, 8 years old, with her mother's green eyes and long blonde hair, usually worn in a ponytail, was excited about the morning Sunday school lesson, which was scheduled to include a craft project making prayer journals. She had been looking forward to this particular activity all week, having heard about it from her best friend, Sarah Elizabeth Hendricks, whose mother taught the 3rd and 4th grade Sunday school class. Madison was the type of child who approached new experiences with enthusiasm and curiosity, traits that made her popular among her peers and beloved by the various adults who supervised church activities. Tyler Patterson, at 5 years old, possessed the boundless energy typical of children his age, along with his father's dark brown hair and his mother's infectious smile. He was carrying his favorite stuffed animal, a brown teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, which had been a gift from his grandmother and rarely left his side during church activities. Tyler's presence in the parking lot that morning would later be cited by investigators as one of the factors that escalated the severity of the attack. As bears often perceive small children as easier targets than adults, and the movement and sounds associated with young children can trigger predatory responses in food-conditioned bears. At 8:56 a.m., Bear 294 reached the edge of the parking lot proper and paused in the shadow of a large cottonwood tree that marked the boundary between the developed church property and the wildlife corridor. From this position, he had a clear view of the Patterson family and several other early arrivals who were moving between their vehicles and the church building. The bear's pause at this location was significant because it represented what animal behaviorists call a commitment point, the moment when an animal decides whether to proceed with an investigation or retreat to safety. Several factors influenced Bear 294's decision-making process during this critical pause. The scents emanating from the Patterson vehicle had grown stronger as he approached, creating what biologists term a scent gradient that provided clear directional information about the source of attractive odors. Additionally, the bear's previous experiences with human-associated food sources had taught him that such encounters typically resulted in easily obtained, high-calorie rewards with minimal risk. His behavioral conditioning had effectively overridden the natural caution that would normally keep a wild bear at a safe distance from human activity. The bear's physical condition also played a role in his decision to proceed. At 740 pounds, Bear 294 was in excellent physical condition for the time of year, having spent the summer feeding on the abundant berry crops and salmon runs in the Gallatin National Forest. However, his hyperphagic state meant that he was driven by an almost constant hunger that made him willing to take risks he might otherwise avoid. Bears in this condition have been observed to investigate human food sources even in the presence of significant human activity, behavior that would be virtually unthinkable during other times of the year. At 8:57:33 a.m., according to the security footage timestamp, Bear 294 made his decision and began crossing the parking lot toward the Patterson vehicle. His initial movement was relatively slow and deliberate, the gait of an animal that was focused on a specific objective, but not yet feeling threatened or pressured. The bear's path took him diagonally across the parking lot, a route that would bring him within 20 yards of several other vehicles, where early church arrivals were unloading their belongings and preparing for the morning service. The first person to notice the bear was Robert Charles Mason, a 57-year-old electrician who served as the church's facilities manager and had arrived early to address a minor issue with the sound system in the sanctuary. Robert was walking from his pickup truck toward the main entrance when he caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision and turned to see what he initially thought was a large dog moving across the parking lot. His first reaction was mild annoyance, as the church had ongoing issues with people allowing their pets to run loose on the property. But this annoyance quickly transformed into shock and then terror as he realized the true nature of what he was seeing. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered, the words barely audible even to himself as his brain processed the impossibility of what his eyes were telling him. A grizzly bear, enormous beyond anything he had seen except in nature documentaries, was walking across the church parking lot with the casual confidence of an animal that had every right to be there. Robert's first instinct was to run, but years of hunting experience had taught him that running from predators was often the worst possible response. Instead, he froze in place, hoping that remaining motionless would make him invisible to the bear's attention. Robert's position, approximately 40 yards from the bear's path and partially concealed behind a large SUV, provided him with an unobstructed view of what happened next. From this vantage point, he could see both the approaching bear and the Patterson family, who remained completely unaware of the danger moving steadily toward them. Robert realized with growing horror that he was witnessing the opening moments of what could become a tragic encounter, but he felt paralyzed by the knowledge that any attempt to warn the Patterson family might trigger the very attack he was hoping to prevent. The next 30 seconds unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. Bear 294 continued his steady approach toward the Patterson vehicle, drawn by the intensifying scent signals that promised easily obtained food. Jennifer Patterson remained focused on organizing her children's Sunday school materials, occasionally glancing toward the church entrance to check the time, but paying no attention to the parking lot around her. Madison and Tyler were engaged in a typical sibling disagreement about whose turn it was to carry the small cooler containing their snacks, their voices carrying clearly across the morning air. At 8:58:05 a.m., Tyler Patterson became the first member of his family to notice the bear. The 5-year-old had wandered several steps away from the vehicle while clutching Mr. Buttons and happened to look up just as Bear 294 emerged from behind a parked sedan approximately 30 yards away. Tyler's reaction was immediate and, from a wildlife management perspective, catastrophically inappropriate. Instead of remaining still or moving slowly toward his mother, Tyler pointed excitedly at the bear and called out in his clear, high-pitched voice, "Mommy, look at the big doggy!" Tyler's exclamation served as the trigger for what wildlife biologists call a rapid behavioral escalation in Bear 294's approach pattern. The bear's head snapped toward the sound, his ears rotating forward as he focused his attention on the small figure pointing in his direction. From the bear's perspective, Tyler's movement and vocalization represented a significant change in the environmental conditions that had allowed his approach to proceed unchallenged. Bears are highly sensitive to sudden changes in their surroundings, and Tyler's reaction provided clear evidence that his presence had been detected. Jennifer Patterson's response to her son's exclamation was initially one of mild confusion rather than alarm. She turned to follow Tyler's pointing gesture, expecting to see someone's pet that had wandered onto church property. The moment her eyes focused on the massive brown form moving steadily across the parking lot toward her family, her nurse's training kicked in with the automatic precision of years of emergency response experience. Her first priority was protecting her children. Her second was avoiding any action that might escalate the situation. And her third was getting help as quickly as possible. "Madison, Tyler, get behind the car right now," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the tone of absolute authority that both children recognized as non-negotiable. She was proud that neither child questioned her instruction or hesitated to comply, both of them moving quickly to the far side of the Explorer while keeping their eyes fixed on the approaching bear. Jennifer's next action was to reach for her cell phone, which was in the front pocket of her purse inside the vehicle. But she realized immediately that turning away from the bear to retrieve it would require taking her eyes off the animal at the worst possible moment. The bear had closed to within 20 yards of the Patterson family and showed no signs of stopping or altering his course. His body language had shifted subtly from exploratory to what Dr. Morrison would later classify as investigative aggressive, characterized by forward head posture, ears in an alert position, and a slightly stiffened gait that suggested increased arousal. Bears exhibiting this behavioral pattern are typically focused on specific objectives and may respond aggressively to anything they perceive as interference with their goals. At this critical moment, several other early church arrivals became aware of the situation developing in their parking lot. Mrs. Dorothy Kowalski, who had completed her building inspection and was walking toward the main entrance, heard Tyler's excited voice calling about a big doggy and turned to investigate. Her reaction upon seeing the bear was immediate and decisive. Drawing on decades of ranch experience dealing with dangerous wildlife, Dorothy began moving quickly toward the church entrance while calling out warnings to anyone within earshot. "Bear in the parking lot," Dorothy shouted, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Everyone get inside now!" Her warnings were heard by at least 6 other people who were scattered across the parking lot at various distances from the developing confrontation. Their reactions varied from disbelief to panic, but most began moving toward the relative safety of the church building with varying degrees of urgency. The commotion created by Dorothy's warnings and the subsequent movement of multiple people across the parking lot had a profound effect on Bear 294's behavioral state. From the bear's perspective, what had begun as a routine investigation of interesting food scents had suddenly become a complex social situation involving multiple potential threats moving unpredictably through his environment. Bears are inherently stressed by situations they cannot control or predict, and the rapidly changing dynamics of the parking lot scene pushed Bear 294's arousal level beyond the threshold where peaceful resolution was possible. Wildlife behaviorists who later analyzed the security footage identified 8:58:47 a.m. as the moment when Bear 294's behavior shifted from investigative to aggressive. The change was visible in his posture, which became more rigid and forward-leaning, and in his movement pattern, which shifted from the rolling gait of a bear, moving casually through his environment, to the more purposeful stride of an animal preparing for confrontation. His ears, which had been in a forward alert position, flattened slightly against his head, and his mouth opened partially, revealing the massive canine teeth that made grizzly bears among the most formidable predators in North America. Jennifer Patterson recognized the change in the bear's demeanor, even without formal training in wildlife behavior. Her experience as a pediatric nurse had taught her to read body language and anticipate escalating situations, skills that translated remarkably well to assessing the intentions of a potentially dangerous wild animal. She realized that the bear was no longer simply investigating their location, but was actively approaching with what appeared to be aggressive intent. Her options for protecting her children were limited, and all of them carried significant risks. The distance between Bear 294 and the Patterson family had closed to approximately 15 yards, well within the range that wildlife experts consider the critical zone for bear encounters. At this distance, a charging grizzly bear could cover the remaining ground in less than 2 seconds, faster than any human could react. Jennifer's training told her to avoid sudden movements that might trigger an attack, but her maternal instincts demanded that she position herself between the bear and her children. She chose a compromise position, moving slowly but deliberately to place herself slightly in front of Madison and Tyler while keeping the explorer between them and the bear. "Stay calm and don't run," Jennifer whispered to her children, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We're going to move very slowly toward the church." Her plan was to use the vehicles in the parking lot as barriers while gradually working their way toward the safety of the church building, a distance of approximately 60 yards from their current position. It was a reasonable strategy based on conventional wisdom about bear encounters, but it failed to account for the specific behavioral patterns exhibited by food-conditioned bears in hunting mode. Bear 294's response to Jennifer's movement was immediate and decisive. The moment she began trying to maneuver her children away from their vehicle, the bear accelerated his approach, closing the distance to 10 yards in a matter of seconds. His movement was no longer the casual investigation of a curious animal, but the focused charge of a predator that had identified its target and was committed to reaching it. The sound of his paws hitting the asphalt created a distinctive drumming rhythm that would haunt the survivors of the attack for months to come. Robert Mason, still frozen in position behind the SUV 40 yards away, later described the bear's charge as like watching a freight train accelerate. The animal's massive size became fully apparent as he moved at speed, his shoulder muscles rippling beneath his thick brown coat, and his enormous head swaying from side to side with each stride. Robert estimated that the bear was moving at least 25 miles per hour during the initial phase of his charge, a speed that seemed impossible for such a large animal, but was actually well within the normal range for an adult grizzly in attack mode. The sound of the bear's approach triggered immediate panic responses in several other people scattered across the parking lot. Michael David Thompson, a 42-year-old insurance agent who served as a church deacon, had just stepped out of his Chevy Silverado when he heard the drumming of paws on pavement and turned to see the massive bear charging across the lot. His first instinct was to get back into his truck, but he realized that doing so would require turning his back on the bear and fumbling with his keys, actions that could prove fatal if the animal's attention shifted to him. Instead, Michael began backing slowly toward the church entrance while keeping his eyes fixed on the developing attack. His position gave him a clear view of the Patterson family's desperate situation, and he found himself torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the desire to help a mother and her children who were clearly in mortal danger. The distance between his location and the Patterson family was too great for him to intervene physically, but he began shouting in hopes of distracting the bear or alerting others inside the church to the emergency developing outside. "Call 911!" Michael bellowed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with stress and terror. "Bear attack in the parking lot! Someone call for help!" His shouts were heard by people inside the church building, but the thick walls and closed doors muffled his words enough that many initially thought he was calling about a car accident or medical emergency rather than a wildlife attack. This miscommunication would contribute to crucial delays in the emergency response that followed. At 8:59:14 a.m., Bear 294 reached the Patterson family's position. Jennifer had managed to move her children approximately 10 feet toward the church, but their progress was far too slow to outpace a charging grizzly bear. The animal's initial contact was with Jennifer herself, who had positioned her body between the bear and her children in a final, desperate act of maternal protection. The impact of 740 pounds of muscle and bone traveling at over 20 miles per hour was devastating. The bear's first swipe caught Jennifer across the left shoulder and upper chest, his claws raking through her lightweight cotton sweater and the skin beneath with surgical precision. The force of the blow spun her around and sent her sprawling across the pavement, her purse scattering its contents in a wide arc around the impact site. The distinctive sound of claws tearing through fabric and flesh was audible to witnesses more than 50 yards away. A wet, ripping noise that several survivors would later describe as unlike anything they had ever heard. Jennifer's training as a medical professional allowed her to assess her injuries even as she hit the ground. The bear's claws had created 4 parallel lacerations across her left shoulder blade and upper chest, each approximately 8 inches long and deep enough to expose the underlying muscle tissue. She could feel the warmth of blood soaking through her sweater and realized that at least one of the wounds had probably severed a significant blood vessel. However, her immediate concern was not her own injuries, but the safety of her children, who were now completely exposed to the bear's attention. Madison and Tyler Patterson's responses to seeing their mother attacked were dramatically different and would influence the subsequent course of events in ways that no one could have predicted. Madison, at 8 years old, possessed enough understanding of the situation to recognize that their mother was seriously injured and that they were in immediate mortal danger. Her reaction was to grab her younger brother's hand and attempt to pull him toward the nearest vehicle, a red Subaru Outback parked approximately 15 feet away. Tyler, however, was too young to fully process what was happening and too attached to his mother to leave her side. Instead of following his sister toward potential safety, he broke free from Madison's grasp and ran toward Jennifer, calling, "Mommy!" in a voice that carried clearly across the parking lot. His movement directly toward the bear, combined with his high-pitched vocalizations, triggered what wildlife experts term a prey response in Bear 294's already highly aroused nervous system. The concept of prey response in large carnivores is well documented in wildlife behavior literature, though it is rarely observed in the context of human-bear interactions. When a predator's nervous system reaches a certain threshold of arousal, rapid movement toward or away from the predator can trigger automatic behavioral sequences that bypass the animal's normal decision-making processes. Tyler's movement pattern, small size and vocalizations combined to present what Bear 294's hardwired predatory instincts identified as vulnerable prey attempting to flee. Bear 294's response was immediate and horrific. The animal pivoted away from Jennifer, who was struggling to regain her footing, and focused his full attention on the 5-year-old boy running directly toward him. The bear's second attack was fundamentally different from his initial swipe at Jennifer, representing a shift from defensive aggression to active predation. Instead of a single swipe intended to neutralize a perceived threat, Bear 294 lunged forward and attempted to grab Tyler with his massive jaws. The attack on Tyler Patterson occurred at 8:59:31 a.m. and was captured in graphic detail by the church's security cameras. The footage, which would later become crucial evidence in the investigation and legal proceedings that followed, showed Bear 294 lowering his head and opening his jaws as Tyler ran toward his injured mother. The bear's bite was aimed at Tyler's torso, but caught the boy's left arm and shoulder as he tried to dodge away at the last possible second. The sound of Tyler's screams as the bear's teeth penetrated his flesh was described by witnesses as unlike anything they had ever heard, a combination of pain, terror, and desperate confusion that cut through the morning air like a siren. The bear's jaws, capable of generating over 1,200 pounds of pressure per square inch, crushed bones and tore muscle with effortless efficiency. Tyler's left arm was nearly severed at the shoulder, held in place only by strips of skin and muscle tissue that somehow escaped the bear's initial bite. Madison Patterson's reaction to seeing her brother attacked was pure instinctive terror. At 8 years old, she lacked the cognitive framework to process the violence unfolding in front of her, but her survival instincts were functioning perfectly. Instead of running directly away from the bear, which would have made her a target for a prey response similar to what Tyler had triggered, Madison dropped to the ground behind the nearest vehicle and curled into the smallest possible shape while covering her head with her arms. Her decision to hide rather than flee was actually the optimal survival strategy for her situation, though she had no way of knowing this at the time. Bears typically focus their attention on moving targets and may overlook stationary objects that don't present obvious threats or opportunities. Madison's position behind the Subaru Outback also provided physical protection from the bear's direct line of sight and created a barrier that would require the animal to make a deliberate decision to investigate her location. Jennifer Patterson's injuries were severe enough to require immediate medical attention, but her maternal instincts overrode any consideration of her own condition. Seeing her son in the bear's jaws triggered a response that transcended normal human behavioral limits. Despite significant blood loss and damage to the muscle groups that controlled her left arm, Jennifer managed to get to her feet and began moving toward Bear 294 and Tyler, shouting at the top of her lungs in an attempt to distract the animal from her son. "Let him go!" Jennifer screamed, her voice carrying a note of desperate authority that seemed to penetrate even Bear 294's predatory focus. "Take me instead." Her approach toward the bear represented everything that conventional wisdom about wildlife encounters warns against. But in her condition and emotional state, conventional wisdom held no relevance. She was a mother watching her child being killed, and no amount of training or rational thought could override the biological imperative to protect her offspring. Bear 294's response to Jennifer's approach was to release Tyler, who collapsed to the pavement in a spreading pool of his own blood, and refocus his attention on what he now perceived as a more significant threat. The bear's behavioral state at this point had moved beyond anything resembling normal wildlife behavior into what Dr. Morrison would later classify as extreme predatory aggression, a condition occasionally observed in large carnivores that have crossed the threshold from defensive responses to active hunting behavior. The bear's second attack on Jennifer was far more severe than his initial swipe. This time, Bear 294 reared up on his hind legs, reaching a height of over 8 feet, and brought his full weight down on Jennifer's body as she tried to reach her son. The impact drove her to the ground with crushing force, and the bear immediately began what wildlife experts term a mauling sequence, a series of bites and claw strikes designed to incapacitate prey as quickly as possible. Jennifer's injuries from this second attack were catastrophic and would ultimately prove fatal despite the heroic efforts of the trauma team at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital. The bear's claws opened massive wounds across her back and legs, while his teeth crushed several ribs and punctured her right lung. However, even as she sustained these terrible injuries, Jennifer continued to fight back with a ferocity that surprised witnesses and may have prevented the bear from returning his attention to her children. The sound of the attack had by now alerted everyone in the immediate vicinity of the church. Inside the building, Pastor Collins was reviewing his sermon notes when he heard the unmistakable sounds of screaming and shouting from the parking lot. His initial assumption was that there had been a car accident, and he immediately began moving toward the main entrance to see if he could provide assistance. Several other church members had similar reactions, creating a flow of people toward the building's exits just as the situation outside was reaching its most dangerous phase. Dorothy Kowalski, who had been among the first to spot the bear and sound warnings, had reached the relative safety of the church entrance, but was now faced with the horrific spectacle of watching a mother and her children being attacked less than 100 yards away. Her experience with ranch life had taught her that direct intervention against a predatory animal often resulted in additional casualties, but every instinct in her body demanded that she do something to help the Patterson family. Dorothy's solution was to create as much noise as possible in hopes of either scaring off the bear or attracting additional help. She began pounding on the church's main doors with her fists while shouting for someone to call 911, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. Her actions had the desired effect of alerting the people inside the building to the true nature of the emergency occurring outside. But they also had the unintended consequence of further escalating Bear 294's already extremely high state of arousal. At 9:45 a.m., the first 911 call was placed by Sandra Michelle Rodriguez, a 39-year-old elementary school teacher who served as the church's volunteer secretary. Sandra had been in the church office preparing the morning's bulletins when she heard Dorothy's pounding and shouting. Her initial call to emergency services accurately described the situation as a bear attack with multiple victims requiring immediate medical assistance. But the location information she provided was initially confusing to the dispatcher. The confusion arose because Sandra, in her stress and panic, initially gave the church's street address as being on Cottonwood Drive rather than Cottonwood Road, a mistake that sent the first emergency response units to the wrong location approximately 3 miles away. This error was corrected within 2 minutes when Dorothy Kowalski took the phone from Sandra and provided the accurate address. But the initial misdirection contributed to crucial delays in the arrival of both medical and wildlife response teams. The 911 call transcript, later released as part of the investigation into the incident, provides a chilling real-time account of the attack's progression. Dispatcher: 911, what's your emergency? Sandra Rodriguez: there's a bear attacking people in our church parking lot. We need help right now. Dispatcher: ma'am, did you say a bear attack? Rodriguez: yes. A huge bear is attacking a woman and her children in the parking lot at St. Matthew's Baptist Church. Dispatcher: what's your location? Rodriguez: 4127 Cottonwood Drive. No, wait, that's wrong. It's Cottonwood Road. The confusion over the address was resolved quickly, but it highlighted one of the challenges that emergency responders face when dealing with high-stress wildlife encounters in urban areas. Unlike wilderness bear attacks, where the location is typically well-established and responders are mentally prepared for wildlife emergencies, urban attacks often catch both callers and dispatchers off guard, leading to communication errors that can delay critical response times. While Sandra was making the initial 911 call, the situation in the parking lot continued to deteriorate. Bear 294 had completed his mauling attack on Jennifer Patterson and was now in what biologists term a heightened vigilance state, aware that his actions had attracted significant attention from multiple humans, but still driven by the predatory instincts that had initiated the attack sequence. The bear's behavior at this point became highly unpredictable, as his natural inclination to avoid human contact warred with his conditioning to associate humans with food sources and his elevated aggression levels. Tyler Patterson remained on the pavement where he had fallen when the bear released him, his injuries severe enough to render him unconscious but not immediately fatal. His left arm was completely useless due to the crushing damage to his shoulder joint and the massive tissue trauma inflicted by the bear's bite, but his vital organs had escaped serious damage. However, he was losing blood at a rate that would prove life-threatening without immediate medical intervention. Madison Patterson maintained her hiding position behind the Subaru Outback, her small body trembling uncontrollably as she listened to the sounds of the attack just yards away from her location. Her decision to remain motionless was undoubtedly saving her life, as Bear 294's attention was focused on the larger threats and opportunities presented by the adults who were now beginning to emerge from the church building. The bear's next target was selected based on a combination of proximity, movement, and opportunity. Robert Mason, who had been frozen behind the SUV throughout the initial attack sequence, finally overcome his paralysis and began moving toward the church entrance. His movement caught Bear 294's attention, just as the bear was assessing the multiple humans now visible around the parking lot's perimeter. From the bear's perspective, Robert represented another potential threat that needed to be neutralized. Bear 294's charge toward Robert Mason began at 9:01:33 a.m. and covered approximately 40 yards in less than 4 seconds. Robert's reaction time was insufficient to reach the safety of the church entrance, but his hunting experience provided him with enough knowledge of animal behavior to attempt an appropriate defensive response. Instead of running, which would have triggered an even more aggressive pursuit, Robert turned to face the approaching bear and made himself appear as large as possible by raising his arms above his head. "Easy, bear," Robert said in as calm a voice as he could manage, his words carrying clearly across the parking lot to the horrified witnesses gathering near the church entrance. "Easy now, just back away." His strategy was based on conventional wisdom about black bear encounters, but he was dealing with a grizzly bear in an extreme state of aggressive arousal, conditions under which normal deterrent tactics are largely ineffective. The bear's attack on Robert was swift and brutal. Bear 294 struck Robert with his right front paw in a motion similar to what he had used on Jennifer, but the impact point was Robert's head and upper torso rather than his shoulder. The force of the blow lifted Robert off his feet and sent him sprawling across the hood of a nearby pickup truck, his body creating a distinctive dent in the vehicle's sheet metal that would later serve as evidence of the tremendous force involved in the attack. Robert's injuries were immediately life-threatening. The bear's claws had opened massive lacerations across his scalp and face, exposing portions of his skull and destroying his left eye completely. Additionally, the impact had fractured several ribs and possibly damaged internal organs, though the full extent of his injuries would not be apparent until he reached the hospital. However, Robert retained consciousness and continued to move, actions that kept Bear 294's attention focused on him rather than seeking additional victims. The attack on Robert Mason marked a crucial transition point in the incident's development. Up to this moment, Bear 294 had been operating under what could be loosely described as predatory behavior patterns, focused primarily on specific individuals who had attracted his attention through proximity to food sources or direct interaction. However, the presence of multiple humans moving around the parking lot's perimeter began to trigger territorial defense behaviors that made the bear perceive the entire area as under threat from human encroachment. Dr. Morrison's post-incident analysis would identify this behavioral shift as the moment when the situation evolved from a localized attack to what wildlife managers classify as a rampage scenario, in which a large predator begins attacking humans indiscriminately rather than focusing on specific individuals or objectives. Rampage scenarios are extremely rare in North American bear attacks, with fewer than a dozen documented cases in the past 50 years, but they represent the most dangerous possible outcome of human-wildlife conflicts. At 9:02:15 a.m., Bear 294 began moving away from Robert Mason's position and toward the cluster of people who had gathered near the church's main entrance, His movement pattern was no longer the focused charge of a predator pursuing specific prey, but the more methodical advance of an animal establishing dominance over territory he perceived as his own. The bear's body language had shifted to what experts term threat display, characterized by a stiff-legged gait, raised hackles, and periodic huffing or jaw-popping sounds that serve as warnings to potential competitors or threats. The group of people near the church entrance included Pastor Collins, Dorothy Kowalski, Sandra Rodriguez, Michael Thompson, and approximately 8 other church members who had emerged from the building in response to the commotion outside. Their initial reaction upon seeing the bear approaching their position was a mixture of disbelief, terror, and confusion about the appropriate response to such an unprecedented situation. Pastor Collins, despite having no formal training in wildlife encounters, attempted to take charge of the situation by organizing the group's response. "Everyone get inside right now," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of pastoral leadership. "Move slowly and don't run, but get through those doors immediately." His instructions were based on common sense rather than specific knowledge about bear behavior, but they were actually appropriate for the circumstances the group faced. However, the process of moving a dozen frightened people through the church's entrance doors, while maintaining the slow, non-threatening movements that the situation required, proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The doors opened inward, requiring people to pull rather than push, and the handles were positioned in a way that required individuals to turn their backs to the approaching bear while opening them. Additionally, several elderly members of the group were moving slowly due to mobility issues, creating a bottleneck that left multiple people exposed in the bear's path. Dorothy Kowalski, despite being 83 years old, displayed remarkable presence of mind during this critical moment. Recognizing that the group's movement toward the doors was too slow and disorganized to be completed before the bear reached their position, she made a decision that undoubtedly saved multiple lives. Instead of continuing toward the entrance with the rest of the group, Dorothy broke away and began moving perpendicular to the bear's line of approach while making as much noise as possible. "Hey, bear!" Dorothy shouted, waving her arms above her head and stepping away from the cluster of people near the doors. "Over here! Come on!" Her actions were based on decades of experience dealing with aggressive animals on the ranch, where drawing a predator's attention away from vulnerable livestock or people was a standard defensive tactic. The strategy was extremely dangerous for Dorothy personally, but it provided the crucial distraction needed to allow the rest of the group to reach safety. Bear 294's response to Dorothy's actions was immediate and exactly what she had hoped for. The bear's attention shifted away from the group near the doors and focused on the elderly woman who was now approximately 30 yards away and moving in a direction that took her further from the church building. From the bear's perspective, Dorothy represented a more immediate challenge to his territorial dominance than the people who were retreating toward the building. The bear's pursuit of Dorothy began at 9:02:58 a.m., and represented the beginning of what would become the most tragic phase of the entire incident. Dorothy's plan had been to draw the bear's attention long enough for the others to reach safety, then attempt to circle back toward the church building herself. However, at 83 years old and weighing barely over 100 pounds, she lacked the speed and agility needed to execute such a maneuver against a 700-pound grizzly bear in full pursuit mode. Bear 294 caught Dorothy Kowalski approximately 50 yards from the church entrance, in an area of the parking lot that provided no cover or barriers that might have slowed his approach. The attack was swift and devastating, with the bear using his massive weight and strength to overwhelm Dorothy's frail body within seconds of reaching her position. The sound of the impact was audible to witnesses inside the church building, a dull thudding noise that several people later described as similar to a car accident. Dorothy's injuries were catastrophic and immediately fatal. The bear's initial attack crushed multiple bones and caused massive internal trauma that would have been unsurvivable even with immediate medical intervention. However, her sacrifice had achieved its intended objective of allowing the other church members to reach the relative safety of the building, though several of them would carry the psychological trauma of watching her death for the rest of their lives. Inside the church, Pastor Collins was attempting to maintain order and coordinate a response to the unfolding emergency while dealing with his own shock and disbelief at what was happening to his congregation. The main sanctuary, which had been prepared for the morning's worship service, had been transformed into an impromptu command center where people were making additional 911 calls, attempting to account for everyone who had been in the parking lot and providing what comfort they could to those who had witnessed the attacks. The second 911 call was placed at 9:03:47 a.m. by Pastor Collins himself, who was able to provide more detailed information about the situation than Sandra Rodriguez had managed in her initial call. This second call included specific information about the number of victims, the severity of their injuries, and the bear's continued presence in the parking lot, information that allowed emergency dispatch to begin coordinating the appropriate response from multiple agencies. "This is Pastor Gerald Collins at St. Matthew's Baptist Church on Cottonwood Road," Pastor Collins said, his voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances. "We have a grizzly bear that has attacked multiple people in our parking lot. We have at least 4 people with serious injuries, including children. The bear is still active and extremely dangerous. We need immediate medical assistance and someone who can deal with this animal." The dispatcher's response reflected the rarity of such incidents in urban Montana. While black bear encounters were relatively common in Bozeman and the surrounding areas, grizzly attacks in populated areas were virtually unprecedented. The dispatcher had to quickly coordinate responses from not only the standard emergency medical and law enforcement agencies, but also the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and potentially the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, depending on the bear's protected status under federal law. The first emergency response unit to arrive at the correct location was a Bozeman Police Department patrol car driven by Officer Maria Elena Santos, an 8-year veteran of the force who had received specialized training in wildlife encounters but had never dealt with anything approaching the severity of the situation she was about to encounter. Officer Santos arrived at 9:07:23 a.m., approximately 6.5 minutes after the initial 911 call, which was actually an excellent response time given the confusion over the address and the unprecedented nature of the emergency. Officer Santos's first challenge was assessing the situation safely while avoiding becoming another victim herself. Her patrol car was equipped with a rifle, but her training emphasized the importance of accurate threat assessment before deploying lethal force, especially in situations involving protected wildlife species. Additionally, the presence of multiple injured civilians in the immediate area meant that any use of firearms carried significant risks of collateral damage. From her position at the parking lot's entrance, Officer Santos could see the bear standing over Dorothy Kowalski's body approximately 60 yards away. The animal appeared to be in a heightened state of alertness, frequently lifting his head to scan the surrounding area and occasionally making huffing sounds that carried clearly across the morning air. More importantly, Officer Santos could see at least 3 injured people scattered across the parking lot who would require immediate medical attention if they were to survive their injuries. Officer Santos's radio call to dispatch at 9:07:41 a.m. provided the first professional assessment of the scene, Unit 247 on scene at St. Matthew's Baptist Church. I have visual confirmation of a large grizzly bear in the parking lot and multiple victims with severe injuries. The bear appears to be guarding or investigating one victim and shows no signs of leaving the area. Request immediate backup, animal control, and multiple ambulances. This is going to be a complex scene. The complexity of the scene was indeed unprecedented in the experience of Bozeman's emergency response agencies. The presence of an active threat in the form of an aggressive grizzly bear meant that medical personnel could not safely access the injured victims without first neutralizing or removing the animal. However, the bear's protected status under both state and federal law meant that lethal force could only be used as an absolute last resort, and any decision to kill the animal would require approval from wildlife management authorities. Meanwhile, Bear 294's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as his adrenaline levels remained elevated and his territorial instincts continued to perceive threats from multiple directions. The arrival of Officer Santos's patrol car, with its flashing lights and radio noise, represented another intrusion into what the bear now considered his territory. Additionally, the bear's natural circadian rhythms and feeding patterns had been completely disrupted by the morning's events, creating a physiological stress state that made calm, rational behavior virtually impossible. At 9:09:15 a.m., Bear 294 began moving away from Dorothy Kowalski's body and toward the area where Jennifer and Tyler Patterson lay injured. This movement brought him closer to Officer Santos's position and also placed him directly between the injured civilians and any potential rescue attempts. From a tactical standpoint, the bear had inadvertently positioned himself in the worst possible location, where he posed a threat to both the existing victims and any emergency personnel who might attempt to provide aid. Tyler Patterson had regained consciousness during the time since his initial injury and was attempting to crawl toward his mother, who lay motionless approximately 10 feet away. His movement across the pavement, leaving a trail of blood from his shoulder wound, created exactly the type of visual stimulus that could trigger another predatory response from Bear 294. Officer Santos realized that she was witnessing the potential setup for another attack and that her window for intervention was rapidly closing. The decision to use lethal force against Bear 294 was made at 9:09:47 a.m., when Officer Santos observed the bear beginning to move toward Tyler Patterson with clear predatory intent. Her training and departmental protocols required her to exhaust all reasonable alternatives before resorting to lethal force, but the imminent threat to a severely injured child left her no viable options. Her radio call to dispatch requesting permission to engage was brief and urgent. Unit 247 requesting immediate authorization for lethal force against the grizzly. The animal is approaching an injured child, and I have no other tactical options. The response from dispatch came within 15 seconds. Unit 247, you are authorized to use whatever force necessary to protect human life. Be advised that Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been notified and additional units are en route. This authorization carried significant legal and political implications, given the protected status of grizzly bears and the potential for federal investigation into any decision to kill such an animal. However, the immediate threat to human life took precedence over all other considerations. Officer Santos's shot was fired at 9:10:03 a.m. from a distance of approximately 50 yards, using a departmentally issued .308 rifle with scope-mounted optics. Her target was the bear's center mass, aiming for the heart-lung area that would provide the most reliable stopping power while minimizing the risk of a wounded but still dangerous animal. The shot was accurate and immediately effective, with Bear 294 collapsing within 10 feet of Tyler Patterson's position. The sound of the rifle shot echoed across the parking lot and the surrounding neighborhood, serving as an audible signal that the immediate threat had been neutralized and that emergency medical personnel could begin accessing the injured victims. However, Officer Santos maintained her position and kept her weapon trained on the bear's body for several additional minutes, as wounded bears have been known to revive unexpectedly and continue attacking. The first ambulance arrived at 9:12:18 a.m., followed by 2 additional units within the next 3 minutes. The Bozeman Fire Department also responded with a rescue truck and hazmat team, as bear attacks often involve significant contamination issues related to blood and other biological materials. The coordination between multiple agencies at the scene was complicated by the fact that this type of incident was outside the normal experience of most responders, requiring improvised protocols and real-time decision-making about priorities and procedures. Jennifer Patterson was the first victim to be assessed by paramedics, as her position was most easily accessible once the bear threat had been eliminated. Lead paramedic James Robert Hendricks, a 15-year veteran with extensive trauma experience, later described Jennifer's injuries as among the most severe he had encountered in his career. The bear's claws had created massive tissue damage across her back and shoulders, while his bite had fractured multiple ribs and punctured her lung, creating a life-threatening condition known as pneumothorax. Jennifer remained conscious during the initial medical assessment, which both facilitated treatment by allowing her to communicate with paramedics and added to the emotional trauma of the situation as she repeatedly asked about her children despite her own critical condition. Her first words to paramedic Hendricks were, "Please help my babies first. Are my babies okay?" Her maternal instincts remained intact, even as she was losing dangerous amounts of blood from her multiple wounds. Tyler Patterson's assessment revealed injuries that were severe but potentially survivable with immediate surgical intervention. The bear's bite had caused crushing damage to his left shoulder joint and had severed several important blood vessels, but his vital organs remained intact. However, his age and small body size meant that he had lost a higher percentage of his total blood volume than an adult would have in similar circumstances, creating a critical need for rapid transport to a facility equipped for pediatric trauma surgery. Madison Patterson was found still hiding behind the Subaru Outback, physically uninjured, but in severe psychological shock. Her refusal to come out from her hiding spot initially concerned paramedics, who worried that she might have sustained injuries that weren't immediately apparent. However, child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Ann Stewart, who arrived on scene as part of the critical incident response team, quickly recognized that Madison's behavior was a normal response to severe trauma and that forcing her to leave her perceived safe space could cause additional psychological damage. Robert Mason was transported in the first ambulance along with Tyler Patterson, as both victims required immediate surgical intervention at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital's Trauma Center. Robert's head and facial injuries were extensive and would require multiple reconstructive surgeries, but his vital signs remained stable throughout the transport process. The paramedic's primary concern was preventing additional blood loss and maintaining his airway, which had been partially compromised by swelling from the facial trauma. Dorothy Kowalski's body remained at the scene pending investigation by the coroner's office and the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks. The investigation into her death would be complicated by questions about whether the bear's attack could have been prevented and whether emergency response protocols were adequate for dealing with wildlife emergencies in urban areas. However, the consensus among witnesses was that Dorothy's actions had saved multiple lives by drawing the bear's attention away from the group near the church entrance. The scene investigation began immediately after the last victim had been transported to the hospital. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison arrived at 9:47 a.m. to begin the wildlife biological assessment that would be required for both the legal proceedings and the scientific analysis of the incident. Her first priority was confirming the identity of Bear 294 through examination of his ear tags and taking tissue samples for genetic analysis. Dr. Morrison's preliminary examination of Bear 294 revealed several factors that had contributed to his aggressive behavior and his presence in an urban environment. The bear showed signs of significant dental problems, including 2 infected molars that would have caused chronic pain and made normal foraging activities difficult. Additionally, his stomach contents revealed large amounts of human food waste, confirming that he had been feeding regularly from garbage and other anthropogenic food sources. The investigation also revealed that Bear 294 had been in the immediate area for at least several days before the attack, based on track evidence and scat samples found throughout the wildlife corridor. This suggested that the bear had been conducting surveillance of the church property and possibly other nearby locations, behavior that should have triggered intervention by wildlife management authorities if it had been detected in time. Pastor Collins spent the remainder of the morning coordinating with investigators and providing support to church members who had witnessed the attack. The planned worship service was obviously cancelled, and the church building was designated as a temporary crisis counseling center for anyone affected by the incident. Several licensed counselors and social workers arrived throughout the morning to provide immediate psychological support to witnesses and family members. The first media reports of the attack began appearing on local news websites and social media platforms within an hour of the incident. Initial reports were often inaccurate or incomplete, with some sources incorrectly reporting the number of victims or the species of bear involved. The sensational nature of a grizzly bear attack in an urban church parking lot made the story attractive to both local and national media outlets, leading to a significant press presence at the scene by midday. Bozeman Police Chief Rebecca Martinez held the first official press conference at 2:15 p.m., providing confirmed information about the incident and attempting to dispel some of the rumors and misinformation that had been circulating on social media. Chief Martinez emphasized that the attack appeared to be an isolated incident involving a specific problem bear, rather than an indication of increasing bear populations or changing bear behavior patterns in the Bozeman area. The hospital response to the mass casualty incident involved activating emergency protocols that brought additional trauma surgeons, pediatric specialists, and support staff to the facility. Dr. Amanda Rose Chen, the chief of trauma surgery, coordinated the medical response and made decisions about resource allocation among the multiple critical patients. The hospital's experience with wilderness-related injuries proved valuable in treating the specific types of trauma associated with bear attacks. Jennifer Patterson was taken directly to the operating room upon arrival at the hospital, where a team of 3 surgeons worked for over 4 hours to repair the damage to her chest, back, and shoulder. The surgical team, led by Dr. Chen, faced the challenge of extensive tissue damage that had been caused by the bear's claws, which created wounds that were both deep and wide, with irregular edges that complicated the repair process. Additionally, the punctured lung required immediate attention to prevent life-threatening complications. The surgery on Jennifer's chest involved repairing multiple lacerations to the intercostal muscles between her ribs, sealing the punctured lung, and reconstructing damaged blood vessels that had been torn by the bear's claws. The surgical team also had to contend with significant contamination of the wounds from dirt, debris, and potentially harmful bacteria that had been introduced by the bear's claws during the attack. This required extensive irrigation and debridement to prevent life-threatening infections. Tyler Patterson's surgery was performed simultaneously in a neighboring operating room by Dr. Maria Santos Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon with specialized experience in traumatic injuries to children. Tyler's case was complicated by his age and the location of his injuries, which involved the complex joint structure of his shoulder and the major blood vessels that supply his left arm. The bear's bite had caused what medical professionals term a crush injury, in which tissues are damaged not only by puncture wounds, but also by the tremendous pressure applied by the predator's jaws. The pediatric surgical team faced the challenge of repairing Tyler's shoulder joint while preserving as much function as possible in his left arm. The bear's bite had fractured the head of his humerus and had damaged the rotator cuff muscles that control shoulder movement. Additionally, several nerves that control arm and hand function had been either severed or severely damaged, raising questions about what level of function Tyler would ultimately recover. Robert Mason underwent the most complex surgical procedures of any of the attack victims, requiring a team that included plastic surgeons, ophthalmologists, and neurosurgeons working together to address his extensive head and facial injuries. The bear's claws had caused damage that extended from his scalp to his upper chest, with the most severe injuries concentrated around his left eye and the left side of his face. The surgical team's first priority was controlling bleeding and preventing brain injury, as some of the bear's claw marks had penetrated through Robert's skull and reached the protective membranes surrounding his brain. Dr. Michael James Hartford, the neurosurgeon on the team, performed a craniotomy to assess and repair damage to the skull and to remove bone fragments that could have caused additional injury. The procedure revealed that while the bear's claws had penetrated the skull, they had not caused significant direct damage to brain tissue. Robert's left eye could not be saved due to the extensive damage caused by the bear's claws, but the surgical team was able to preserve enough of the surrounding tissue to allow for the eventual fitting of a prosthetic eye. The reconstruction of his facial features would require multiple additional surgeries over the course of several months, as the initial procedures focused primarily on life-saving interventions rather than cosmetic outcomes. Madison Patterson was not physically injured in the attack, but she required specialized pediatric psychological care to address the trauma of witnessing the violence inflicted on her mother and brother. Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, worked with Madison throughout the day to provide immediate crisis intervention and to begin the process of helping her process what she had experienced. The psychological impact of the attack on Madison was complicated by her age and her relationship to the other victims. At 8 years old, she was old enough to understand that her mother and brother had been seriously hurt, but too young to fully comprehend the medical and legal complexities surrounding their treatment and recovery. Additionally, her role as a witness to the attack meant that she would likely be called upon to provide testimony to investigators, a process that could re-traumatize her if not handled with extreme care. The investigation into the bear attack involved multiple agencies with sometimes overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities. The Bozeman Police Department was responsible for the criminal investigation, though the likelihood of criminal charges being filed was minimal given the nature of the incident. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks was responsible for the biological investigation and for determining what factors had contributed to Bear 294's presence in an urban area and his aggressive behavior toward humans. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also became involved due to the federal protected status of grizzly bears under the Endangered Species Act. While the decision to kill Bear 294 was clearly justified by the immediate threat to human life, federal regulations required a thorough investigation to ensure that all appropriate protocols had been followed and that efforts had been made to avoid lethal force if possible. Dr. Morrison's biological investigation revealed several troubling facts about Bear 294's behavior and condition that raised questions about wildlife management protocols in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The bear's stomach contents showed clear evidence of garbage consumption, including plastic materials, aluminum foil, and processed food products that should never be part of a wild bear's diet. This indicated that Bear 294 had been feeding regularly from human sources for an extended period before the attack. The investigation also revealed that there had been multiple unreported sightings of a large grizzly bear in the Cottonwood Road area during the weeks preceding the attack. Several residents had observed the bear but had failed to report these sightings to wildlife authorities, either because they didn't realize the significance of the observations or because they were concerned about potential restrictions on their property use that might result from an official wildlife investigation. The failure of residents to report Bear 294's presence highlighted a significant gap in the early warning systems that wildlife managers rely on to prevent human-bear conflicts. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that if the bear's presence had been reported even a week before the attack, wildlife authorities would have had sufficient time to implement aversive conditioning techniques or relocation procedures that could have prevented the tragedy. The legal implications of the attack began emerging within days of the incident. While no criminal charges were filed in connection with the bear's actions, questions arose about potential civil liability on the part of various agencies and individuals who might have had opportunities to prevent the attack. The church faced potential lawsuits related to their security protocols and their failure to warn congregation members about known wildlife risks in the area. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks faced more serious legal challenges related to their management of Bear 294 and their failure to respond adequately to the bear's escalating behavioral problems. Internal department documents revealed that wildlife biologists had identified Bear 294 as a potential public safety risk more than 2 years before the attack. But budget constraints and competing priorities had prevented the implementation of appropriate management actions. The federal investigation conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service focused primarily on the decision-making process that led to Bear 294's death and whether alternative methods of protecting human life could have been employed. The investigation ultimately concluded that Officer Santos's actions were appropriate and legally justified, but it also identified several systemic problems in the coordination between local law enforcement and federal wildlife management authorities. Media coverage of the attack intensified in the days following the incident, with national news outlets picking up the story and providing extensive coverage of both the attack itself and the broader issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts in the American West. The story became a focal point for debates about wildlife management policies, urban development in wildlife habitat, and the effectiveness of current protocols for preventing dangerous wildlife encounters. The coverage was not always accurate or helpful, with some outlets sensationalizing the attack or using it to advance particular political or environmental agendas. Several stories incorrectly reported the number of victims or the severity of their injuries, while others focused on the bear's protected status rather than the human tragedy that had occurred. The Patterson family, in particular, found themselves subjected to unwanted media attention at a time when they were focused on Tyler and Jennifer's medical recovery. Pastor Collins became an unofficial spokesperson for the church community affected by the attack, conducting several interviews with local and regional media outlets in an effort to provide accurate information about the incident and to request privacy for the victims and their families. His public statements emphasized the congregation's support for the Patterson family and their gratitude for the heroic actions of Dorothy Kowalski, who had sacrificed her life to save others. The community response to the attack was immediate and overwhelming, Within hours of the incident, local residents began organizing fundraising efforts to help cover medical expenses for the victims and their families. A GoFundMe page, established for the Patterson family, raised over $50,000 in its first week, while local businesses donated goods and services to support the family during Tyler and Jennifer's hospitalization. St. Matthew's Baptist Church, The Next Stories, Polar Bear kills whole family of 4 on Ice Road, February 11th, 2025. The Arctic wind howled across the endless expanse of white that stretched from Igloolik to Hall Beach, carrying with it the promise of death that February morning. Henry Foster pressed his weathered hands against the steering wheel of their black 2019 Ford Expedition, his knuckles white beneath work-worn skin as he navigated the treacherous ice road that served as Nunavut's frozen highway. Beside him, his wife Clara adjusted the thermostat for the third time in 10 minutes, her breath visible in small puffs despite the vehicle's laboring heater. In the back seat, their teenage children Madison and Luke sat absorbed in their phones, earbuds blocking out the world beyond their small electronic universes, blissfully unaware that they were driving through some of the most dangerous predator territory on Earth. Henry Foster, 47 years old, had spent the better part of 2 decades working the oil rigs in Alberta before a back injury forced him into early retirement. His broad shoulders still carried the strength of his younger years, though his dark hair had begun to silver at the temples, and deep lines etched the corners of his green eyes from years of squinting against industrial lights and prairie sun. He had met Clara during a brief stint working construction in Winnipeg, where she had been teaching elementary school at River Heights Community School. Clara Foster, née Johansson, was 43, with the kind of natural beauty that had only deepened with age. Her blonde hair now streaked with premature grey that she refused to dye, saying it made her look distinguished. Her blue eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent 15 years managing classrooms full of energetic children, and her small frame belied the fierce protective instinct that drove every decision she made regarding her family. Their daughter Madison, 17 and a senior at Calgary's Western Canada High School, possessed her mother's delicate features, but had inherited her father's stubborn determination. She was captain of the debate team and had already received early acceptance letters from 3 universities, though she had yet to decide between studying journalism at the University of British Columbia or environmental science at McGill. Her younger brother Luke, 15 and a sophomore at the same school, was built more like his father, with broader shoulders, and a natural athleticism that made him a star on the hockey team. Both children had grown up hearing their father's stories about the remote regions of Canada where he had worked, but this trip to Nunavut to visit Clara's estranged sister Catherine, who had moved to Iqaluit 5 years earlier to work as a nurse, would be their first real exposure to the true wilderness of the Canadian Arctic. The Foster family had begun their journey 3 days earlier from their modest 2-story home in the suburban neighborhood of Kensington in northwest Calgary. Henry had spent weeks planning the route, studying maps and weather reports, checking and double-checking their supplies. Their expedition was loaded with emergency gear, sleeping bags rated to -40 degrees, a portable propane heater, enough food for a week, extra gasoline in approved containers, flares, a satellite phone, and even a .308 Winchester rifle that Henry kept locked in a case beneath the rear seat. Clara had initially objected to bringing the weapon, but Henry's experience in remote locations had taught him that preparation could mean the difference between life and death in the unforgiving wilderness of northern Canada. The first leg of their journey had taken them north through Alberta and Saskatchewan, then east across Manitoba to Thompson, where they had spent the night in a modest motel. The second day brought them further north to Churchill, the famous polar bear capital of the world, where they had stopped to refuel and grab lunch at a local diner. Luke had been fascinated by the stories the locals told about the massive predators that gathered near the town each fall, waiting for Hudson Bay to freeze so they could return to their hunting grounds on the sea ice. Madison had purchased a book about polar bear biology from the Churchill Northern Studies Centre gift shop, reading aloud facts about how an adult male could weigh over 800 pounds and reach speeds of 25 miles per hour across ice and snow. The proprietor of the diner, a weathered Inuit man named Thomas Kiviak, who had lived in Churchill for 63 years, had approached their table after overhearing their conversation about driving north to Nunavut. Thomas was a small man with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the Arctic itself, his face marked by decades of exposure to harsh winds and brutal cold. He wore a traditional parka made from caribou hide, and his hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent hunting and fishing in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. "You folks heading up the ice road to Nunavut?" Thomas had asked, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who chose his words with purpose. When Henry confirmed their destination, Thomas's expression grew serious. "Been driving those roads for 40 years, and I'm telling you, this winter's been different. Ice is thicker than usual, but the bears, they're acting strange, not following their normal patterns. Climate's been shifting, and when the climate shifts, predators get desperate." Clara had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. "What do you mean, acting strange?" she had asked, setting down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. Thomas had pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate and measured. "Usually this time of year, big males are out on the bay ice hunting seals, but we've had 3 separate incidents in the past month of bears coming inland, approaching vehicles, acting aggressive. Fish and wildlife folks think it's because the seal populations have been moving further north, forcing the bears to expand their territory. A polar bear that can't find food is the most dangerous animal in the world." Madison had looked up from her book, her young face suddenly serious. "How dangerous are we talking about?" Thomas had studied her for a long moment before answering. "Miss, I've seen a full-grown polar bear tear through a steel drum like it was made of paper. I've watched them flip over four-wheelers and drag snowmobiles across the ice like they were toys. If a hungry polar bear decides you're a threat or a meal, there's not much on this earth that's going to stop it." Henry had thanked Thomas for the warning and assured him that they were well prepared and would be careful. But as they had left Churchill that afternoon, continuing north toward the ice road that would take them across the frozen landscape to Nunavut, Thomas's words had echoed in his mind like a prophecy of doom. Now, 24 hours later and 200 miles further north, Henry found himself thinking about that conversation as he guided their vehicle across what locals called the Ice Highway, a temporary road that existed only during the winter months when temperatures dropped low enough to freeze the ground and waterways solid enough to support vehicle traffic. The landscape around them was a study in white and grey, broken occasionally by the dark silhouettes of stunted trees or the geometric shapes of ice pressure ridges where shifting ice had buckled and thrust upward in jagged formations that resembled the backbone of some massive prehistoric creature. The temperature outside had dropped to -28 degrees Fahrenheit, and despite the expedition's heating system working at maximum capacity, frost still formed on the inside corners of the windows. Clara pulled her winter coat tighter around her shoulders and checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. They had been driving for 7 hours since leaving their overnight stop in Rankin Inlet, and according to Henry's calculations, they still had another 3 hours before reaching the small community of Hall Beach, where they planned to spend the night before continuing to Iqaluit the following morning. "Dad, how much further?" Luke asked from the back seat, pulling out one earbud and leaning forward. At 15, he was already taller than his mother and showed signs that he would eventually match his father's 6'2" frame. His dark hair was cut in the style popular among his teammates, shorter on the sides and longer on top, and his brown eyes held the restless energy of youth, combined with the first hints of adult curiosity about the world beyond his familiar suburban environment. "About 3 hours to Hall Beach," Henry replied, his eyes never leaving the narrow track that served as their road. On either side, the snow stretched away to the horizon, broken only by occasional markers, tall poles with reflective tape that helped travelers stay on the designated route. The ice road was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and in many places it was nothing more than a compressed snowpath marked by the tire tracks of previous travelers. Madison looked up from her phone, frowning at the lack of signal bars. "There's no cell service up here at all." "Welcome to the Arctic," Clara said with a wry smile. "Your father brought a satellite phone for emergencies, but other than that, we're completely cut off from civilization. It's actually kind of nice, don't you think? No distractions, just family time and the most beautiful wilderness on Earth." Madison was not entirely convinced that complete isolation qualified as nice, but she had to admit that the landscape possessed a stark beauty unlike anything she had ever experienced. The late afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow and turning the entire world into a study of blue and gold. Occasionally they would crest a small rise and be able to see for miles in every direction, the pristine whiteness broken only by the dark line of their road stretching toward the distant horizon. Luke pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass. "It's so empty," he said with a mixture of wonder and unease. "Like, completely empty. We haven't seen another car in 2 hours." "That's because we're in one of the most remote regions on the planet," Henry explained, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel as a gust of wind rocked the vehicle. "The entire population of Nunavut is less than 40,000 people spread across an area the size of Mexico. Most communities are only accessible by plane, and even this ice road only exists for about 4 months out of the year." Clara pulled out the thermos of hot chocolate she had prepared that morning and poured steaming cups for everyone. The sweet, warm liquid was a welcome comfort against the bitter cold that seemed to seep through every seal and joint of their vehicle. Despite the expedition's reputation for cold weather reliability, she could hear the engine working harder than usual, and the heater fan had developed a slight rattle that suggested the extreme temperatures were taking their toll on their mechanical systems. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that preceded sunset in the Arctic. The sun, which had never climbed very high above the horizon even at midday, was now beginning its descent toward what would be a prolonged twilight. In this region, during winter, daylight hours were precious and brief, with full darkness falling by late afternoon and not lifting until well after sunrise the following morning. Henry had been monitoring their fuel consumption carefully, and by his calculations, they had used slightly more gasoline than expected. Due to the difficult driving conditions and the extra load of emergency supplies. He made a mental note to top off their tank in Hall Beach and perhaps purchase an extra container of fuel for the final leg of their journey to Iqaluit. The extreme cold affected everything from battery life to tire pressure to fuel efficiency, and even with his years of experience in harsh environments, the Arctic demanded a level of caution and preparation that exceeded anything he had encountered in his previous work. At 3:15 p.m., they encountered their first major obstacle. Ahead of them, the road curved around what appeared to be a large frozen lake, but as they approached the curve, Henry could see that something was wrong. The snow on the road surface had been disturbed, and there were what looked like tire tracks leading off the main route toward a cluster of pressure ridges about 200 yards to the east. He slowed the expedition to a crawl and activated the hazard lights, though there was no other traffic to warn. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, sensing the change in her husband's demeanor. "Not sure," Henry replied, bringing their vehicle to a complete stop. "Looks like another vehicle might have had trouble here. See those tracks leading off the road?" Through the windshield, they could see the unmistakable sign of a vehicle that had left the designated route, probably involuntarily. The tracks led across the snow toward a jumbled collection of ice formations, and there, barely visible against the white landscape, was the dark outline of what appeared to be a pickup truck, tilted at an odd angle. "Should we check it out?" Madison asked, her journalism instincts already engaging with the mystery of the abandoned vehicle. Henry considered their options. Every instinct told him to stay on the road and continue toward Hall Beach, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to pass by without at least determining whether someone needed help. In this environment, a stranded motorist could freeze to death within hours, especially if they were injured or their vehicle's heating system had failed. "I'm going to drive over and take a look," he decided, easing the expedition off the main track and following the tire tracks toward the abandoned truck. "But everyone stays in the vehicle unless I say otherwise. This cold will kill you faster than you can imagine if you're not properly prepared." The snow was deeper off the main road, and Henry could feel their tires spinning slightly as they made their way across the uneven terrain. The abandoned vehicle was a white Nissan Frontier, and as they approached, they could see that it had slid sideways into a depression between two pressure ridges and become thoroughly stuck. The driver's side door was standing open, and snow had drifted into the cab. Henry stopped their expedition about 50 feet away and activated the parking brake. "I'm going to take a quick look," he announced, reaching for his heavy parka. "Keep the engine running and be ready to get out of here quickly if something seems wrong." "Henry, be careful," Clara said, her voice tight with concern. She had learned to trust her husband's judgment during their years of marriage, but something about the scene felt wrong to her. The open door, the drifted snow, the complete absence of any signs of recent human activity all combined to create an atmosphere of abandonment that made her deeply uneasy. Henry zipped his parka to his neck and pulled on insulated gloves before opening his door. The Arctic air hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his nostrils and causing his eyes to water. The wind was stronger than it had been earlier in the day, and he could hear it whistling through the ice formations with a sound like voices calling from a great distance. He approached the abandoned truck cautiously, his boots crunching through the snow with each step. The vehicle was definitely empty, and from the amount of snow accumulation in the cab, it had been sitting here for at least several hours, possibly longer. There were no footprints visible around the truck, but given the wind and blowing snow, tracks could disappear within minutes in these conditions. Henry circled the vehicle, looking for clues about what had happened to its occupants. The truck appeared to be undamaged except for being stuck, and there were no obvious signs of mechanical failure. The keys were still in the ignition, and when he tried them, the engine turned over, but would not start, probably due to the extreme cold and the battery being drained by the open door. As he completed his examination of the truck, something caught his eye in the snow about 20 feet away. It was a dark stain, partially covered by fresh snow, but still visible as a discoloration against the pristine white surface. Henry approached it carefully, his heart rate increasing as he recognized what he was looking at. Blood. A significant amount of blood, scattered across an area roughly 10 feet in diameter. The implications hit him like a punch to the stomach. Someone had been injured here, badly injured, and recently enough that the blood hadn't been completely obscured by wind and snow. But there were no footprints, no drag marks, no indication of where the injured person might have gone or been taken. Henry was turning to head back to his family when he saw the tracks. Not human tracks, but animal tracks, and they were massive. Each print was nearly a foot long and showed the distinctive five-toed pattern of a bear, but these were far larger than any black bear or grizzly tracks he had ever seen. These were the tracks of a polar bear, a large one, and they led from the blood-stained area directly toward a cluster of pressure ridges about 100 yards to the north. His blood turned to ice water as he realized what he was looking at. The abandoned truck, the blood, the massive bear tracks, all told a story that he didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. Someone had been attacked here, dragged away by one of the Arctic's apex predators, and based on the size of the tracks, it was a bear that could easily weigh 800 pounds or more. Henry began backing away from the scene, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for any sign of movement. Polar bears were known for their intelligence and patience, and if this one had claimed a kill in this area, it might very well still be nearby, protecting its territory or its food source. Every survival instinct he had developed during his years in remote locations was now screaming at him to get his family away from this place as quickly as possible. He was halfway back to their expedition when Clara rolled down her window. "Henry, what did you find? Get back inside and lock the doors," he called back, not wanting to alarm his family, but knowing they needed to leave immediately. "We need to go. Now." But as he approached their vehicle, he noticed that their rear wheels had sunk deeper into the snow during the few minutes he had been away. The combination of the engine's heat and the weight of their loaded SUV had caused the snow beneath them to compress and partially melt, creating a depression that their tires had settled into. Henry climbed into the driver's seat and immediately put the expedition in reverse, but when he pressed the accelerator, the wheels spun uselessly. He tried rocking the vehicle back and forth, alternating between reverse and drive, but succeeded only in digging them deeper into the increasingly soft snow beneath their tires. "What's wrong?" Madison asked from the back seat, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the vehicle. "We're stuck," Henry said grimly, his mind racing through their options. "I'm going to have to dig us out." "Dad, what did you see over there?" Luke asked, his voice reflecting the fear that was beginning to permeate the family's mood. Henry looked at his wife and children, weighing his words carefully. He didn't want to panic them, but they needed to understand the seriousness of their situation. There was an accident. Someone was hurt, badly hurt, and there are signs that a large predator was involved. Clara's hand went to her throat. "What kind of predator?" "Polar bear," Henry said quietly. "A big one, and it might still be in the area." The silence that followed his words was broken only by the sound of the wind against their vehicle and the steady hum of the engine. Madison closed her book and stared out the window with new eyes, suddenly seeing the pristine Arctic landscape not as beautiful wilderness, but as the domain of creatures that could kill without warning or mercy. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry was already reaching for his heavy boots and parka. "I have to dig us out. There's no choice, but I want everyone to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and watch for any movement outside. If you see anything at all, you honk the horn and I'll get back here as fast as I can." He retrieved a collapsible shovel from their emergency supplies and prepared to venture back into the brutal cold. The temperature was continuing to drop as afternoon gave way to evening, and the wind was picking up, creating a wind chill that would be life-threatening within minutes for anyone not properly protected. As Henry worked to dig their vehicle free, scraping away the compacted snow from around their tires and looking for something to provide traction, his family huddled inside the expedition, eyes wide as they scanned the surrounding landscape. The abandoned truck sat like a monument to disaster about 50 yards away, its open door a stark reminder that they were not the first travelers to encounter trouble in this remote location. Clara had taken out the satellite phone and was studying the instruction manual, trying to familiarize herself with its operation in case they needed to call for help. The device showed a weak but adequate signal, which meant they could potentially contact emergency services if their situation became desperate. But she also knew that in this remote location, even if they could summon help, it would likely take hours or even days for rescue to arrive. Madison had put away her phone entirely and was now pressed against the window, watching her father work while simultaneously scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The golden afternoon light was beginning to fade, and she knew that once darkness fell, their situation would become exponentially more dangerous. Polar bears were most active during twilight hours, and their white fur made them nearly invisible against the snow, even at relatively close distances. Luke had moved to the opposite window, providing coverage of the other side of their vehicle. Despite his youth, he understood the gravity of their situation, and the hockey player's competitive instincts that served him well on the ice were now focused on protecting his family. He had located the case containing his father's rifle and was studying the combination lock, though he had no idea what the numbers might be. Henry had been digging for 15 minutes when he encountered the first major problem. The snow beneath their rear tires had not just compacted, it had partially melted and then refrozen into solid ice. His shovel was making little impact on the frozen surface, and he realized he would need something more substantial to break through the ice layer. He returned to the vehicle and retrieved a small pickaxe from their emergency supplies, ignoring his family's concerned questions as he went back to work. The physical exertion of swinging the pickaxe helped keep him warm, but he could feel the extreme cold sapping his strength and knew he couldn't maintain this level of activity for long without risking exhaustion or hypothermia. It was 4:23 p.m. when Madison saw the movement. At first, she thought it was just a wind-blown piece of snow or debris, a white shape shifting among the pressure ridges to the north of their position. But as she watched, the shape moved again, and this time there was no mistaking the deliberate, purposeful nature of its movement. Something large and pale was moving among the ice formations, something that was definitely alive and seemed to be approaching their location. "Mom," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "There's something out there." Clara looked in the direction Madison was pointing, squinting against the glare of snow and fading sunlight. For a moment she saw nothing, and then the shape moved again, and her blood turned to ice water. It was massive, easily the size of a small car, and it was moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. "Henry!" Clara shouted, rolling down her window despite the blast of Arctic air. "Henry, get in here now!" Henry looked up from his work, saw the panic in his wife's face, and immediately dropped his tools. He had learned to trust Clara's instincts completely during their marriage, and the terror in her voice told him everything he needed to know about the urgency of the situation. But as he turned to run back to their vehicle, he saw it. The polar bear had emerged from behind the pressure ridges and was now in full view, standing motionless about 150 yards away. It was enormous, easily the largest wild animal Henry had ever seen, with a massive head and shoulders that spoke of incredible physical power. Its black nose and eyes stood out starkly against its cream-colored fur, and even at this distance, Henry could see the intelligence in its gaze as it evaluated him and his family. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the wind-swept expanse of snow and ice. The bear was clearly aware of their presence and was studying them, with the patient calculation of an apex predator deciding whether they represented a threat, a meal, or something to be ignored. Henry knew that any sudden movement could trigger an attack, but he also knew that remaining exposed in the open was equally dangerous. The bear took a step forward, then another, and Henry realized with growing horror that it was not going to ignore them. This was a hunting approach, the slow, deliberate advance of a predator that had identified potential prey and was closing the distance for an attack. "Get in the car!" Clara screamed, no longer concerned about startling the animal. "Get in the car right now!" Henry ran for their vehicle, his boots slipping on the packed snow as he struggled to maintain his footing. Behind him, he could hear the bear's movement change from a walk to a lope, and he knew with terrible certainty that he was not going to make it to safety before the predator reached him. The polar bear was covering ground with shocking speed, its powerful legs driving it across the snow with an efficiency that millions of years of evolution had perfected. What had seemed like a safe distance of 150 yards was disappearing at an alarming rate, and Henry could hear the animal's heavy breathing and the sound of its claws against the hard-packed snow. He reached their expedition and threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him just as the bear reached their vehicle. The impact, when 800 pounds of polar bear collided with the passenger side of their SUV, was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. The entire vehicle rocked violently, and the sound was like a freight train colliding with a building. Clara screamed and grabbed for Luke, who had been thrown against the opposite window by the impact. Madison was thrown forward against the back of the front seat, her head striking the headrest with enough force to leave her dazed and disoriented. Henry fought to maintain control of the vehicle as the bear's assault continued, massive paws striking their SUV with enough force to dent the metal and spider the reinforced glass of the windows. The bear's massive head appeared outside Clara's window, close enough that she could see the individual whiskers around its black nose and the calculation in its dark eyes. For a moment, bear and human stared at each other through the glass, and Clara realized she was looking into the eyes of her own death. The intelligence she saw there was not the mindless hunger of a simple predator, but the focused intent of a highly evolved hunter that had identified its prey and was now determining the most efficient method of killing. Henry threw the expedition into reverse and pressed the accelerator to the floor, but their tires only spun uselessly in the depression he had been trying to dig them out of. The bear seemed to understand that they were trapped and increased the intensity of its attack, using its claws to rake along the side of their vehicle with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified 100-fold. "The gun!" Luke shouted over the sound of the bear's assault. "Dad, where's the gun?" Henry had forgotten about the rifle in the chaos of the attack, but now he reached beneath the rear seat, feeling for the hard case that contained their only real means of defense. His fingers found the latches, but the combination lock was still engaged, and he couldn't remember the numbers in his panic. The bear had moved to the front of their vehicle and was now standing on its hind legs, towering above their SUV like some primordial nightmare. It brought its massive paws down on the hood with enough force to buckle the metal and crack the windshield. The sound was deafening, and the entire family could feel the structural integrity of their vehicle beginning to fail under the sustained assault. 4792! Clara suddenly shouted, remembering Luke's hockey jersey number. "The combination is 4792! Henry's fingers worked frantically at the lock as the bear continued its attack, now focusing its attention on the driver's side windshield. The reinforced glass was beginning to give way under the repeated impacts, and Henry knew they had minutes at most before their protective barrier failed completely. The lock opened, and Henry extracted the Winchester .308 from its case, his hands shaking as he tried to remember the loading procedure. He had fired the rifle many times at the shooting range, but never under these conditions, never with his family's lives hanging in the balance and a massive predator trying to tear their vehicle apart around them. He managed to load a cartridge into the chamber just as the windshield finally gave way. Safety glass exploded inward, covering the front seats with thousands of small fragments, and suddenly there was nothing between the Foster family and 800 pounds of enraged polar bear except 3 feet of frigid Arctic air. The bear's massive head pushed through the opening where the windshield had been, its black nose snuffling as it investigated these strange creatures that had invaded its territory. Its breath was visible in the cold air, and the family could smell the wild, musky scent of the predator along with something else. something metallic and unpleasant that they realized was the smell of blood from the bear's previous kill. Henry raised the rifle, trying to sight along the barrel, while the bear's massive paw swept through the air inches from his face. He had never imagined trying to shoot from inside a vehicle, and the confined space made it nearly impossible to maneuver the weapon effectively. The bear's movements were too quick and unpredictable, and he was terrified of missing and wounding the animal, which would only increase its fury. The polar bear seemed to sense the threat represented by the rifle and backed away from the vehicle slightly, but it did not retreat. Instead, it began circling their SUV, looking for the most vulnerable point of attack. Its intelligence was evident in the way it evaluated their defenses, testing the strength of different windows and doors, learning the layout of this strange metal cave that contained its prey. "Why isn't it leaving?" Madison whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind and the bear's continued investigation of their vehicle. "Because we're in its territory," Henry replied grimly, keeping the rifle trained on the massive predator as it completed its circuit of their SUV. "And because it's hungry. Polar bears can go months without eating, but when they're hunting, they don't give up easily." The bear had returned to the front of their vehicle and was now examining the damage it had inflicted. The hood was badly dented, the windshield was gone, and several of the other windows had been cracked by the intensity of its assault. But more importantly, the bear seemed to have learned that the strange metal shell could be breached, that the creatures inside were not as protected as they had initially appeared. Clara had managed to get the satellite phone operational and was frantically trying to contact emergency services. The device showed a weak signal, but she was able to connect to a dispatcher in Iqaluit, who took down their location and the nature of their emergency. However, the dispatcher's response was not encouraging. The nearest rescue helicopter was based in Yellowknife, over 400 miles away, and even if it departed immediately, it would not be able to reach them for several hours. Weather conditions were deteriorating, and night was falling, which would make any rescue operation exponentially more difficult and dangerous. "Help is coming," Clara told her family, though she knew the words were more hope than reality. "We just have to survive until they get here." The bear had moved to Luke's side of the vehicle and was now standing on its hind legs again, pressing its massive paws against the window. The glass was holding for now, but spiderweb cracks were beginning to appear under the pressure, and it was clear that this barrier would not hold much longer than the windshield had. Luke pressed himself against the opposite seat, as far from the window as he could get, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space of the SUV. He could see the bear's claws, each one several inches long and capable of tearing through flesh and bone with ease. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in for the 15-year-old, the understanding that they might not survive the next few minutes, let alone the next few hours. "Dad, can you shoot it?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear and adolescent uncertainty. Henry was asking himself the same question. The rifle was powerful enough to bring down the bear, but only if he could place the shot accurately in a vital area. A wounded polar bear would be even more dangerous than a healthy one, and he would likely only get one chance. The animal's thick fur and layer of fat provided significant protection, and anything less than a perfect shot to the brain or heart would probably only enrage it further. The decision was taken out of his hands when the window beside Luke finally gave way. The bear's massive paw pushed through the safety glass, and suddenly those terrible claws were inside their vehicle, sweeping back and forth as the predator tried to reach the terrified teenager. Luke threw himself across the seat toward Madison, who grabbed him and pulled him away from the reaching claws. But there was only so far they could go in the confined space. Henry took aim and fired, the sound of the rifle shot deafening in the enclosed space of the SUV. The bullet struck the bear in the shoulder, spinning it away from their vehicle, but the wound was not fatal. Instead of retreating, the injured predator became even more aggressive, roaring with pain and fury as it renewed its assault on their vehicle with doubled intensity. The bear's roar was unlike anything any of them had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, expressing rage and pain and an absolute refusal to be denied. It was the sound of apex predation, of millions of years of evolution that had created the perfect Arctic killing machine, and it struck fear into the most primitive parts of their brains. Now, wounded and enraged, the polar bear abandoned any pretense of caution and launched a full-scale assault on their vehicle. It attacked the remaining windows systematically, using its claws and teeth to tear through glass and metal with shocking efficiency. The passenger side door began to buckle under the repeated impacts, and Henry realized with growing horror that their protective shell was failing faster than he had thought possible. He worked the bolt action of the rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and loading another round, but the bear was moving too quickly for him to get a clear shot at a vital area. Every time he thought he had a target, the massive predator would shift position, presenting only its heavily muscled back or shoulders, where a shot would be unlikely to prove immediately fatal. Clara had managed to contact the emergency dispatcher again and was providing a running commentary of their situation, though she knew there was little the authorities could do from hundreds of miles away. The dispatcher was trying to locate any aircraft or ground vehicles that might be in their area, but the remote location and deteriorating weather conditions made immediate rescue virtually impossible. Madison had wrapped her arms around Luke, both teenagers now understanding that they were facing the very real possibility of death. The bear's assault on their vehicle continued with mechanical precision, each blow calculated to cause maximum damage to their defenses. It was clear that this was not the random attack of a startled animal, but the deliberate hunting behavior of a predator that had decided they were prey. The passenger door finally gave way at 4:47 p.m., torn from its hinges by the bear's incredible strength. Suddenly, there was a gaping hole in their defenses, and 800 pounds of enraged polar bear was pushing its massive body through the opening. Clara scrambled toward the driver's side of the vehicle, pulling Luke with her, while Madison pressed herself against the rear window in a futile attempt to put distance between herself and the predator. Henry swung the rifle around, trying to get a point-blank shot at the bear's head, but the confined space made it nearly impossible to maneuver the weapon effectively. The bear's massive paw swept across the interior of the SUV, claws extended, and Henry felt a line of fire across his chest as the razor-sharp talons tore through his heavy parka and the clothes beneath. The pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline kept him functional as he continued trying to position the rifle for a killing shot. The bear was half inside their vehicle now, its massive head and shoulders filling the passenger compartment as it sought to reach the humans who had wounded it and invaded its territory. Clara screamed as one of the bear's claws caught her jacket, tearing through the insulated material and leaving parallel scratches along her arm. Blood began to seep through the torn fabric, but the wounds were superficial compared to what the predator was capable of inflicting. She knew they were living on borrowed time, that each second the bear spent trying to maneuver in the confined space of their SUV was a second closer to the moment when it would succeed in reaching one of them. Luke had found his voice and was screaming, the sound high and wordless. Expressing terror beyond anything his young mind had been prepared to process. The reality of violent death had entered his world with shocking suddenness, transforming him from a carefree teenager into a survival statistic in the span of minutes. Madison, despite her fear, was trying to think rationally about their situation. Her journalism training had taught her to observe and analyze, and even in the midst of this nightmare, part of her mind was cataloging details. The bear's behavior, the failure points of their vehicle, the way fear affected each member of her family differently. If they survived this encounter, she knew these details would be crucial for understanding what had gone wrong and how similar tragedies might be prevented. Henry finally managed to press the rifle's muzzle against the side of the bear's massive head, directly behind the ear, where he hoped to penetrate to the brain. He pulled the trigger, and the shot was muffled by the contact with the bear's thick fur. But the effect was immediate and devastating. The polar bear's body went rigid for a moment, then convulsed violently before going completely still. The massive predator had been killed instantly by the point-blank shot to the brain, but its body was wedged in the passenger doorway, partially blocking their escape route and filling their vehicle with the overwhelming presence of death. For several minutes, the family sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. The sudden cessation of the bear's assault left their ears ringing and their minds struggling to accept that the immediate threat was over. The smell of gunpowder, mixed with the wild scent of the bear and the metallic smell of blood, creating an atmosphere that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Henry was the first to recover enough to speak. "Is everyone okay? Is anyone hurt?" Clara was examining the scratches on her arm, which were bleeding but not deep enough to be life-threatening. "I'm okay," she said, her voice shaking. "Just scratched. What about you?" Henry looked down at his torn parka and saw that the bear's claws had left parallel cuts across his chest, but like Clara's wounds, they appeared to be superficial. The heavy winter clothing had provided just enough protection to prevent serious injury, though both of them would bear scars from this encounter for the rest of their lives. Madison and Luke were physically unharmed, but emotionally traumatized by what they had witnessed. The violence of the attack and the proximity of death had shattered their assumptions about safety and security in ways that would take years to fully understand and process. "We need to get out of here," Henry said, working to extract the bear's body from their doorway. "There might be other bears in the area, and our vehicle isn't going to protect us anymore." But as they surveyed the damage to their SUV, the reality of their situation became clear. The windshield was completely gone, one door had been torn off entirely, and several windows were shattered. The engine was still running, but the hood had been so badly damaged that they couldn't see if any vital components had been affected. More critically, they were still stuck in the same depression that had trapped them initially. And now they had the additional problem of a dead 800-pound polar bear blocking their exit. The temperature was continuing to drop as evening approached, and without the protection of their vehicle's intact passenger compartment, they would be exposed to the full fury of the Arctic wind. Hypothermia would become a life-threatening concern within hours, especially for the children who had smaller body masses and less cold weather experience than their parents. Henry managed to move enough of the bear's body to clear their exit, though the effort required every ounce of strength he possessed. The dead predator was incredibly heavy, and its awkward position made it nearly impossible to manipulate. By the time he had created enough space for his family to exit the vehicle, he was exhausted and beginning to show the early signs of cold exposure. Clara had been monitoring the satellite phone and managed to re-establish contact with emergency services. The dispatcher informed her that a search and rescue helicopter had been dispatched from Yellowknife, but weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and the aircraft might not be able to reach them before morning. The forecast called for blowing snow and temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that would make any rescue operation extremely dangerous. "We need shelter," Henry said, surveying their damaged vehicle and the hostile environment around them. "The SUV won't protect us from the cold anymore, and we can't survive a night in the open." They gathered their emergency supplies from the vehicle: sleeping bags, a portable heater, emergency food, and additional winter clothing. Henry also retrieved several flares and his remaining ammunition, though he hoped they wouldn't encounter another predator. The effort of moving their supplies away from their vehicle was exhausting in the extreme cold, and all 4 family members were already beginning to show signs of cold stress despite their heavy winter clothing. About 200 yards from their disabled SUV, they found a cluster of pressure ridges that formed a natural windbreak. It wasn't ideal shelter, but it would provide some protection from the worst of the Arctic wind while they waited for rescue. Henry used their collapsible shovel to excavate a depression in the snow, creating a space just large enough for all 4 of them to huddle together. The work was brutally difficult in the extreme cold, and Henry's earlier injuries made every movement painful. But he knew that their survival depended on creating adequate shelter, and he pushed himself beyond the limits of exhaustion to prepare their refuge. Clara and the children gathered loose snow to build walls around their depression, working together despite their fear and trauma to improve their chances of survival. By the time they had completed their makeshift shelter, full darkness had fallen, and the temperature had dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was gusting to over 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that would be lethal to exposed skin within minutes. They huddled together in their sleeping bags, sharing body heat and running their portable propane heater on its lowest setting to conserve fuel. The night that followed was the longest of their lives. Despite their sleeping bags and shared body heat, the cold penetrated their improvised shelter with relentless persistence. They took turns staying awake to monitor the heater and watch for signs of hypothermia in other family members. But sleep was nearly impossible due to the cold, the wind, and the adrenaline that continued to course through their systems. Luke developed the early stages of hypothermia around midnight, his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels despite all their efforts to keep him warm. His speech became slurred, and he began showing signs of confusion and disorientation that indicated his core body temperature was falling below the threshold necessary for normal brain function. Clara and Henry worked frantically to rewarm their son, sharing their body heat and using heated water from their emergency supplies to gradually raise his temperature. The process was agonizingly slow, and there were several hours when they weren't sure he would survive until morning. The helplessness of watching their child slip away while being unable to do anything more than provide primitive warming techniques was almost as traumatic as the bear attack itself. Madison, despite her own fear and cold, helped tend to her brother throughout the night. She monitored his breathing and pulse, applied first aid techniques she had learned in high school health class, and provided the emotional support that helped keep Luke fighting against the hypothermia that threatened to claim his life. Dawn came slowly to the Arctic landscape, bringing with it temperatures that had dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit and wind conditions that had worsened overnight. Their portable heater had run out of fuel around 4 a.m., and since then they had been surviving on body heat alone. All 4 family members were now showing signs of severe cold exposure, and Henry knew they couldn't survive another night in these conditions. The satellite phone had frozen sometime during the night, and despite their efforts to rewarm it, they couldn't re-establish contact with emergency services. They had no way of knowing whether rescue aircraft were still attempting to reach them or had been grounded by the deteriorating weather conditions. At 7:30 a.m., they heard the sound that would save their lives, the distant beating of helicopter rotors cutting through the Arctic air. The search and rescue aircraft had departed Yellowknife at first light, flying in conditions that were at the absolute limits of safe operation. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mackenzie, was a veteran of dozens of Arctic rescues, but even she later described the conditions that morning as among the worst she had ever encountered. Henry managed to ignite one of their emergency flares, sending a column of red smoke into the grey morning sky. The helicopter crew spotted the signal and was able to locate their position among the jumbled ice formations. Landing was impossible due to the terrain and wind conditions, but the aircraft was equipped with a rescue hoist that could extract survivors from the ground. The rescue operation took over an hour to complete, with each family member being individually lifted from their improvised shelter to the hovering helicopter. Luke, who was in the most serious condition due to his hypothermia, was hoisted first and immediately began receiving medical treatment from the aircraft's paramedic. Clara went next, followed by Madison and finally Henry, who insisted on being the last to leave their survival site. The flight to the hospital in Iqaluit took 45 minutes, during which the medical crew worked to stabilize all 4 family members and begin the process of treating their various injuries and cold-related conditions. Luke's hypothermia was the most serious medical concern, but all of them required treatment for frostbite, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of their ordeal. They spent the next 4 days in Iqaluit General Hospital, recovering from their physical injuries and beginning the long process of psychological healing. The story of their survival against a polar bear attack in one of the world's most hostile environments made international news, with reporters from around the world calling the hospital to request interviews with the family. Clara's sister Catherine, who had been waiting for their arrival in Iqaluit, provided emotional support and helped coordinate with the media requests. She was shocked by the transformation she saw in her sister's family. The confident, adventurous people who had left Calgary less than a week earlier had been replaced by trauma survivors who jumped at unexpected sounds and seemed to have aged years in the span of days. The investigation into the incident was conducted by Nunavut's Department of Environment, which sent a team of wildlife biologists to examine the attack site and the remains of both the polar bear and the unknown victim, whose blood Henry had discovered near the abandoned truck. The bear was determined to be an adult male weighing approximately 820 pounds in good physical condition, but showing signs of recent starvation that had likely made it more aggressive and desperate for food. The abandoned truck was traced to a local hunter named Peter Kanguk, a 43-year-old Inuit man from Hall Beach who had been reported missing by his family 3 days earlier. His remains were eventually located about a half-mile from the attack site, and the investigation determined that he had been killed by the same polar bear that later attacked the Foster family. Kanguk had been an experienced Arctic traveler, but his truck had become stuck in the same area where the Fosters later encountered problems, and the hungry bear had taken advantage of his vulnerability. The official report concluded that climate change and shifting ice conditions were forcing polar bears to alter their traditional hunting patterns, bringing them into increased contact with human travelers. The bear that attacked both Kanguk and the Foster family had likely been unable to access its normal seal hunting grounds due to unusual ice conditions and was desperately seeking alternative food sources. Wildlife authorities implemented new safety protocols for ice road travelers, including mandatory check-ins with local communities, requirements for satellite communication devices, and recommendations for traveling in convoys rather than single vehicles. Signs were posted at ice road entry points, warning of increased polar bear activity and providing emergency contact information. The psychological aftermath of the attack proved to be more challenging for the Foster family than their physical recovery. Luke struggled with nightmares and anxiety attacks for months after the incident, requiring ongoing counseling to help him process the trauma of nearly dying from hypothermia while listening to a polar bear destroy their vehicle. Madison channeled her experience into her writing, eventually producing a series of articles about Arctic safety and climate change impacts on wildlife behavior that were published in several national magazines. Clara found it difficult to return to her teaching position, as the constant noise and chaos of an elementary school classroom triggered flashbacks to the sounds of the bear attack. She eventually took early retirement and began working as a tutor, finding that the quieter, more controlled environment was better suited to her changed psychological state. Henry never fully recovered his enthusiasm for wilderness adventures. The man who had once sought out remote and challenging environments became content to experience nature from a safe distance, preferring car camping in established campgrounds to the kind of true wilderness travel that had previously defined his free time. The family's relationship with each other was actually strengthened by their shared survival experience. The knowledge that they had faced death together and survived created bonds between them that transcended the normal challenges of family life. They developed a communication style that was more direct and honest, having learned that life was too precious and unpredictable to waste on petty disagreements or unspoken concerns. 1 year after the attack, the family returned to the Arctic, not to travel the ice roads, but to visit the communities they had been trying to reach when disaster struck. They met with local Inuit leaders and shared their story as part of a safety education program designed to help other travelers understand the realities of Arctic travel. Their account became part of a documentary film about human-wildlife conflicts in the changing Arctic environment. The insurance settlement from their destroyed vehicle allowed Henry to purchase a new SUV, but it remained parked in their garage for several months before any family member felt comfortable traveling in it. When they finally began taking road trips again, they never ventured more than a few hours from major population centers, and their vehicle was always equipped with multiple communication devices and enough emergency supplies to support them for weeks if necessary. Madison's college choice was influenced by her Arctic experience as she decided to study environmental journalism at the University of British Columbia, specializing in climate change impacts on northern ecosystems. Her senior thesis project was a comprehensive examination of human polar bear conflicts across the Arctic, combining her personal experience with extensive research into the biological and sociological factors that contribute to these increasingly common encounters. Luke's recovery took longer than the rest of his family's, partly due to his age and the severity of his hypothermia, but also because the attack occurred during a crucial period of his psychological development. The experience gave him a mature understanding of mortality and risk that was unusual for someone his age, but it also created anxiety about situations beyond his control that affected his academic performance and social relationships for several years. The family began participating in Arctic safety education programs, sharing their story at conferences and workshops designed to help other travelers prepare for wilderness emergencies. Their presentation always emphasized the importance of proper equipment, communication devices, and understanding animal behavior. But it also stressed that even the best preparation couldn't eliminate all risks in truly remote environments. 5 years after the attack, climate scientists studying Arctic ecosystems contacted the Foster family to discuss their observations of polar bear behavior during the encounter. Their detailed account of the bear's hunting strategy, intelligence, and persistence provided valuable data for researchers trying to understand how changing environmental conditions were affecting predator behavior patterns. The site of their survival became a waypoint for other ice road travelers, marked by a small memorial to Peter Kanguk and a warning sign about polar bear activity in the area. The abandoned truck was eventually removed, but the location remained notorious among Arctic travelers as a place where proper preparation and quick thinking had made the difference between life and death. Henry kept the rifle that had saved his family's lives, though he never used it for hunting again. It remained in a place of honor in their home, a reminder of the moment when civilization's technology had been the only thing standing between them and prehistoric death. Clara occasionally caught him looking at the weapon with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. and she knew he was reliving those crucial seconds when everything had depended on his ability to place a single, perfect shot. The story of their survival was eventually adapted into a made-for-television movie, though the family was not entirely happy with the dramatic liberties taken by the scriptwriters. The film emphasized action and suspense over the methodical preparation and teamwork that had actually enabled their survival, and it minimized the long-term psychological impacts that continued to affect all 4 family members years after the incident. Madison's journalism career flourished, partly due to the credibility her survival experience lent to her reporting on wilderness and environmental issues. She became a recognized expert on human-wildlife conflicts and was frequently consulted by government agencies and conservation organizations developing policies for Arctic travel and wildlife management. Her reporting consistently emphasized the need for education and preparation rather than fear-based avoidance of wilderness areas. Luke eventually overcame most of his anxiety issues, though he never developed any interest in wilderness travel or camping. His brush with death at such a young age had given him a profound appreciation for life, but also a preference for urban environments where threats were more predictable and manageable. He became a successful software engineer, drawn to the logical, controllable world of computer programming, where problems had definite solutions and debugging was a matter of systematic analysis rather than life-or-death decision-making. The satellite phone that had been their lifeline during the attack became a family heirloom, carefully maintained and tested regularly, even though they hoped never to need it again in an emergency situation. Clara insisted on carrying it during all their travels, no matter how benign, because she had learned that disaster could strike without warning in any environment. The legal proceedings following the attack were minimal, as Canadian authorities determined that the family had acted appropriately in defending themselves and that the bear's behavior was consistent with a starving predator seeking food rather than an unprovoked attack. No charges were filed, and the incident was classified as a justified killing in self-defense. Wildlife biologists who examined the bear's remains found evidence that the animal had been without food for an extended period, probably due to ice conditions that had prevented it from accessing its normal seal hunting grounds. This finding supported the theory that climate change was creating more frequent conflicts between polar bears and humans, by forcing the animals to seek alternative food sources in areas where they might encounter people. The Foster family's survival story became a case study in wilderness survival courses, emphasizing the importance of proper equipment, family teamwork, and maintaining calm decision-making under extreme stress. Survival instructors particularly praised Henry's methodical approach to the crisis and the family's disciplined adherence to safety protocols, even in the midst of a life-threatening emergency. 10 years after the attack, the family made a pilgrimage to the site of their survival, traveling by helicopter rather than ground vehicle. The landscape looked much the same as it had during their ordeal, though climate researchers noted that ice conditions in the region had continued to change in ways that were likely to increase human-wildlife conflicts in the future. Standing at the location where they had nearly died, surrounded by the same pressure ridges that had provided their life-saving shelter, the family reflected on how the experience had changed them. They were different people than they had been before the attack, more cautious, more appreciative of safety and security, but also more aware of their own resilience and ability to survive under impossible conditions. The memorial to Peter Kanguk had been expanded into a small monument, recognizing all victims of polar bear attacks in the Arctic, with educational materials about wildlife safety and climate change impacts. The Foster family added their own contribution to the memorial, a plaque thanking the rescue personnel who had saved their lives and encouraging other travelers to prioritize safety over adventure when planning Arctic journeys. Their story continued to inspire survival education programs and wildlife safety initiatives throughout the Arctic regions of North America. The combination of proper preparation, family teamwork, and pure determination that had enabled their survival became a model for how ordinary people could overcome extraordinary challenges when faced with life-threatening situations in remote environments. The psychological scars from their ordeal never completely healed, but the Foster family learned to view their experience as a source of strength rather than trauma. They had looked death in the face and survived through their own actions and decisions, an experience that gave them confidence to face other challenges in life with the knowledge that they were capable of far more than they had ever imagined. The bear that nearly killed them became a symbol in their family mythology, representing not evil or malevolence, but the awesome power of nature and the importance of respecting the environment while refusing to be paralyzed by fear. Their survival had required them to kill the magnificent predator, but they took no pleasure in its death, understanding that the bear had been following its own instincts in a world that climate change was making increasingly difficult for Arctic wildlife. Years later, when asked what they had learned from their ordeal, Henry Foster would always give the same answer: that survival in extreme situations depends less on physical strength or equipment than on the ability to think clearly, work together, and refuse to give up hope even when death seems certain. Their family's bond had been forged in the crucible of Arctic survival, creating a connection that transcended the normal relationships between parents and children, husbands and wives. The story of the Foster family's survival against a polar bear attack on the ice roads of Nunavut became more than just an account of wilderness adventure gone wrong. It became a testament to human resilience, family bonds, and the importance of preparation and education when venturing into the world's most dangerous environments. Their experience served as both warning and inspiration to countless other travelers who dreamed of exploring the Arctic wilderness while understanding the very real risks that such adventures entailed. In the end, their survival had required everything they possessed: physical equipment, mental preparation, emotional strength, and pure determination. The polar bear that attacked them represented the ultimate test of their ability to function as a family unit under the most extreme stress imaginable, and their success in that test created bonds between them that would last for the rest of their lives. The Arctic had tested them to their absolute limits and found them worthy of survival, an experience that changed their perspective on risk, adventure, and what truly mattered in life forever. I've created an extensive wilderness survival horror novel about the Foster family's encounter with a polar bear on the Arctic ice roads.